Before the beginning, there was the balance. Before the war of angels and demons that scorched the young reality raw. Before the Nephilim rode and fell. Before the Council of the Charred made itself judge and jailer of all things. There was only the great cold weighing of order against ruin, and the fire in which that weighing was done. The Charred Council was not a place. It was a wound in creation that had learned to speak. 3 faces of blackened rock and living flame reared up out of a lake of embers, each vast as a mountain, each burning with the slow, contemptuous patience of things that had watched galaxies kindle and gutter like tallow. Around them the void was neither space nor warp nor any dimension a mortal astronomer could chart. It was the seam between realities, the place the balance was kept, and from it the council watched everything. It watched the way a spider watches the whole of its web at once, not with eyes, but with the trembling of every strand. For an age uncounted, the strands had trembled true. Order and chaos had leaned against one another, as they were meant to, neither prevailing, the great scale level, and the council had slept its half-sleep of vigilance and been content. Then, across an unthinkable gulf, a single strand went taut. And then 1,000, and then the whole web screamed. "You feel it," said the first face, and its voice was the grinding of continents. It was not a question. A galaxy. The second face turned in its fire, molten rock sloughing from its jaw and hissing into the ember lake. One galaxy, of the numberless galaxies beneath our law, and it burns wrong. The third face said nothing for a long while. When it spoke, the embers dimmed, as though the words drank their heat. Not burning. That we permit. Fire is the balance breathing. This is worse. This is a scale with no fulcrum. Order without mercy on one arm, and on the other. A pause, ancient and appalled. On the other, gods. 4 of them, gorged fat on murder and rot and lies and hunger, feeding on the very war meant to keep them chained. There is no balance in this place. There is only a slow fall into the mouths of the ruinous. And it spreads. The council had ruled since before ruling had a name, and it did not tolerate what it could not weigh. This galaxy could not be weighed. Its chaos was not the council's chaos, not the destroyer principle the council held in one hand as it held order in the other. This was something that had names and appetites, and it was winning, and worst of all it was fed by the exact fratricide the council had spent an eternity forbidding. Brother against brother, son against father, an empire of 1,000,000 worlds turning its blades inward, while the dark laughed and grew. "We have an instrument for fratricide," said the first face. "We forged it long ago, from the ashes of the last time creation forgot its place." And in the Ember Lake, the council turned its attention to 4 figures who had knelt before it more times than any of them could bear to remember. 4 riders, the last of the Nephilim, the race the council had unmade, save these 4, who had been spared because they had agreed to become the executioners of their own kind, the council's hounds, the council's hand, the 4 horsemen. They stood apart even now, the way they always stood, bound to one purpose, and trusting one another and no one else, least of all the fire that commanded them. War came forward first, as war always did. Broad as a fortress gate, armored in scorched crimson iron, the great blade Chaos Eater slung across his back like a girder torn from some cathedral. His gauntleted hand rested near its grip out of habit, older than thought. He had ended the apocalypse and been blamed for starting it. He had worn the council's leash and the watcher's chain, and never once bent his neck willingly. When he looked up into the 3 faces, there was no fear in him, and no love either, only the flat, waiting patience of a weapon that wanted to know where it would be pointed. "You have a war for us," War said. It was not eager. It was not reluctant. It simply was. Behind him, Death stood in the deeper shadow, as Death preferred. Leaner than his brother, all whipcord and old bone, the pallid mask fixed over a face none of them had seen bare in centuries. 2 harvester blades crossed at his back. On his shoulder perched Dust, the crow, its eyes twin points of cold interest. Death had killed more of his own kin than any being in creation, had drowned the Nephilim in their own blood at the council's word to buy his brothers and sister their lives, and he carried that murder the way a mountain carries its own weight, without complaint, without excuse, and without ever setting it down. He said nothing. He rarely did. until it mattered. But the tilt of the mask said he was listening to something the others could not yet hear. The far-off screaming of that taut and terrible web. Fury came next, and where she walked the embers shrank from her. Serpent-lithe, her whip scorn coiled at her hip like a living thing, her hair a plume of white fire. She had once been the proudest of the four, and pride had nearly destroyed her. She had conquered it, had walked into the fire of her own vanity, and come out something harder and truer, and now she wore that hard-won humility like armor over armor. She looked at the three great faces with a wariness her brothers lacked, because she alone among them had learned, at ruinous cost, how a proud thing is unmade. A galaxy of gods, she said, tasting the words. You would send 4 riders against gods. We would send 4 riders to restore the balance, the second face corrected. What that requires, we leave to you. Strife was the last, and he was leaning against nothing at all, arms crossed, both his heavy pistols, mercy and redemption, holstered and gleaming. The very picture of a man who had already decided this was a bad idea, and come along anyway. Of the 4 he trusted the council least, which was a fierce competition. He'd spent his long existence reading the angle behind the order, the debt behind the favor, the trap behind the open door. Restore the balance, he echoed, and there was a razor in the drawl, in a galaxy that's never had one. That's not restoration. That's conquest wearing a nicer coat. You're not asking us to fix their scale. You're asking us to build one, out of a war that's already got 4 hungry gods running it. He shook his head slowly. You're sending us somewhere your writ doesn't run, somewhere the council's never ruled. And you know it. The 3 faces of the Charred Council burned in silence, and for a moment, the ember lake stilled. We know it, said the third face at last. And that admission, from the fire that admitted nothing, silenced even Strife. Whoever's out there deciding what rides through next, this is your seat at the table. If a collision like this is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, and drop the universe and the character you want thrown into the meat grinder next. Any universe, any character, the channel takes on all of them. This one rides because Codicil Yards called it down out of the fire, and it's written by me. Now, back into the dark. Understand what you are being sent into, the first face said, and as it spoke, the ember lake became a mirror, and in the mirror, the 4 horsemen saw the galaxy that had broken the web. They saw a spiral of 100,000 million stars, and every star a possibility, and across all of it a single guttering thread of gold, a light that streamed from one world, one throne, one being, and held a fragile order together by sheer unyielding will, a father of demigods. An empire built in his name across 10,000 years of conquest, faithless and reasoned, that worshipped nothing and denied the very gods now devouring it. The horsemen understood empire. They had ridden through the fall of them. Then they saw the thread of gold begin to fray, and they saw why, and even war went still. They saw sons turn on the father, not a son, sons, whole legions of them, transhuman giants sculpted for war, splitting down the middle as a great war master gilded in eye-searing majesty, raised his hand against the one who made him. They saw worlds die not by tens but by the score, whole populations rendered to ash in a single stroke, a massacre world where loyal sons were shelled by their own brothers, the virus bombs blooming, the survivors climbing out of the dead, only to be gunned down by the legions they'd have died beside a season before. They saw the war god of a butcher legion drowning in a red haze, chained axes rising and falling, and something ancient and starving smiling behind his eyes. They saw a temple city, where a golden preacher knelt not to a god of order, but to the 4 hungers themselves, and thanked them. And behind all of it, over all of it, feeding on all of it, they saw the 4. Not faces, the council had faces. The 4 had appetites, vast beyond the frame of the mirror. A brass throne on a mountain of skulls that rose with every death. A garden of beautiful rot that flowered wherever despair took root. A labyrinth of a billion scheming eyes that fed on every lie and every hope, and a perfumed hunger so total it turned even love and art and excellence into fuel. They did not keep the balance. They were the imbalance. They had made this entire war, this glorious, doomed, self-immolating war of a father and his sons, into a feeding trough. There is your imbalance, said the second face, a galaxy eating itself to feed its own jailers. It will fall. And when it falls, the strand snaps, and the web tears wider, and the ruinous learn they can do to other galaxies what they have done to this one. The balance does not permit that. We do not permit that. Fury's whip hand had tightened. Death had gone very, very still, in the way he did before he killed. Even Strife had no quip. War spoke for them, because the weight of it fell to him. And our authority there, he said slowly, the Council's law, the seventh seal, the writ, the leash, the things that make our judgment, and not just four riders killing our way across a battlefield. How much of it crosses over with us? The Charred Council was silent. None of it, Death said. His voice was quiet and terrible and certain. He had not needed the Council to answer. He had heard it in the screaming of the web from the first. Their war has its own law. Their gods have their own hunger. Nothing we carry means anything there. Not the Council's name, not the balance, not the crimes we were made to punish. We arrive as strangers, four souls with no writ, in a galaxy of gods who eat souls. The mask tilted toward the fire. You are not sending your enforcers. You are throwing 4 coins into a furnace and hoping they land as a verdict. We are sending the only instrument that has ever ended a war between brothers, the third face said, and there was something almost like need in it. You did it once. You unmade your own kind to save the balance. This galaxy is doing to itself what the Nephilim did to creation. Ride in, judge it, and do what only you 4 have ever had the will to do. It was not a request. It had never been a request. In all the ages the horsemen had knelt in this fire. But there was a difference, this time, and all 4 of them felt it. The Council was afraid. The arbiters of all things, who weighed suns and unmade races, and had never once flinched, were afraid of a single spiral galaxy and its 4 fat gods. There is a condition, Fury said suddenly, and her voice cut through the ember glow like scorn through flesh. There is always a condition. With you. Tell it now, or we don't ride. The first face burned lower. You will not arrive together, it admitted. The tearing of the seam, into a galaxy whose chaos is not our chaos. It will scatter you. Each of you will land alone, in a different fire, among different players in their war. You will have to find one another across a burning galaxy before you can act as one. And every hour you are apart, 4 separate souls of a richness their gods have never tasted will be walking, alone, through the hungriest reality in creation. Strife laughed. Short, bitter, real. There it is, he said. There's the trap in the open door. You're not sending 4 riders. You're sending 4 bait. His hand drifted to Mercy's grip, an old and comfortless comfort. 4 of the fattest souls those gods have ever smelled, scattered and separated, right into the middle of their feast. Yes, said the Charred Council, all 3 faces at once, and the ember lake blazed white. Death stepped forward then. Death, who had gone first into worse than this, who had carried more murder than any of them, and never once refused the road. He did not argue. He did not bargain. He looked into the 3 great faces of the fire that had made him a fratricide to save his family, and he made the choice he had always made. Then throw the coins, Death said. And the Charred Council opened the seam, and the fire took them, and 4 riders of the ended world fell screaming out of one reality and into a galaxy that had never known balance, and would, very soon, learn what it meant to be judged. The seam did not release War so much as reject him. He came out of the between place the way a shell comes out of a barrel, fast, screaming, and aimed at killing. One instant there was fire and the grinding voices of the Council. The next there was a sky the color of a bruise turned inside out, a sky so choked with ash and promethium smoke that the sun was only a paler stain in the general dark, and War was falling through it with Chaos Eater already in his fist. He hit the ground the way a meteor hits, and the ground was not ground, it was bodies. He came to rest in a crater of the dead, and for a moment, one long, ringing moment, even War, who had ridden through the fall of empires, was still. The crater walls were made of corpses, not scattered dead, not a battlefield's ordinary harvest, but corpses stacked and fused and crushed into strata, layer on layer on layer, a geology of slaughter that went down further than he could see. Giants, most of them. Transhuman warriors in armor the color of old blood and armor the color of night, their ceramides split and scorched, their faces, those that still had faces, frozen in the particular betrayal of soldiers killed by men they had called brothers. Under the giants, smaller dead, mortal soldiers in their tens of thousands, the merely human chaff of a war that measured its butchery in worlds. And over all of it hung a stench war knew intimately, and had never smelled at this scale. The reek of virus death, of flesh eaten from within by an engineered plague, of an entire population unmade in an afternoon, and left to liquefy under a poisoned sky. Istvan. He did not know the name. He would never know the name, but he knew the shape of the thing, because he had spent his existence learning the shapes of atrocity, and this one he recognized. A father's finest sons, lured to one killing ground and murdered by their own kind, the loyal butchered so the war could truly begin. A dropsite massacre. Betrayal industrialized to the scale of continents. War rose out of the crater of the dead. Ruin was not with him. The steed had not crossed the seam, and so he climbed on foot, chaos eater rasping against fused ceramite, and every step took him up through another year of the dead. When his gauntlet found purchase on the shoulder plate of one of the fallen giants, the great corpse shifted, and War looked into the dead face of a warrior 3 times the mass of a mortal man, and understood something about the scale of this galaxy that the Council's mirror had not conveyed. These were the foot soldiers. These were the ordinary killers of this war, and they had died here in their tens of thousands. Then, from the strata of the dead, something moved that was not war and was not dead. It was one of the giants, a loyalist. War would learn that word later. For now he only saw the armor of old blood, cracked and blackened, and the great crude fist that closed around a bolter with the last strength in a ruined body. The warrior had been buried alive under his own slaughtered legion, virus-scorched and shell-torn, and he had been dying by inches for a day and a night, and he was not going to stop being a soldier just because he was going to stop being alive. Half his face was gone. The half that remained turned toward the sound of war climbing, and the single surviving eye, bloodshot, filmed, but burning with a hatred so pure it had outlasted the man's body, fixed on the crimson giant rising from the corpse strata with a black blade in his fist. And the dying loyalist saw a demon. He could not have seen anything else. His entire universe had narrowed, over the last hell day, to a single truth. The sky had betrayed them. Brothers had murdered brothers, and the warp had opened, and let its horrors spill onto the killing ground, to feast on the dying. He had seen things climb out of the ash that had no right to walk. He had seen the traitor legions painting themselves in the marks of the 4 hungers, and now, out of a crater full of his murdered brothers, rose a red iron giant wreathed in the psychic pressure of something not native to reality, carrying a blade that drank the light, and the dying man's shattered mind gave it the only name it had left. Daemon, the loyalist said. It came out as a wet rattle, blood and broken lung, but there was iron under it, the flat, unbreakable refusal of a man who had already decided to spit in the face of hell on his way out of the world. His ruined hand hauled the bolter up. Come to feast. On the fallen. On my brothers. The barrel wavered, steadied, found War's chest. Not, while I, draw breath. War stopped. He could have crossed the distance before the man's finger closed. He was faster than the loyalist could comprehend, and Chaos-Eater had ended things far larger and far less broken than this dying soldier. But War did not move, and the reason he did not move was the reason he was War, and not merely a killer. He understood, in that ash-choked crater, exactly what he was looking at. Not a foe, a soldier, a loyal thing dying for a father who had already lost, cursing the dark with the last of himself, and mistaking judgment for damnation because in this galaxy there was, apparently, no difference the man had ever been allowed to learn. I am not the thing you think I am, War said. The bolter did not lower. They all say that. Blood. The warp. Wears. Kind faces. Sometimes. The eye burned. You wear. A killer's. Yes, War agreed. Because it was true. And War did not lie. I am a killer. But not one of yours. And not one of theirs. He turned his head, slow, taking in the crater, the strata, the poisoned sky. the whole vast obscene machinery of the massacre. When he spoke again, there was something in his voice the dying man had not heard in a day and a night of horror. Not comfort, which would have been a lie, but acknowledgement. Who did this? The loyalist coughed a laugh that tore something loose inside him. You don't know. And then, because a dying man tells the truth to daemons the same as to priests, our brothers, our father's sons, the War Master. The name came out like a curse and a wound together. We came to bring 3 legions back to the Emperor's light. Loyal, we came loyal. The eyes streamed, and it was not only blood. And they dropped us here, and then the other 3, the ones we thought, stood beside us. The bolter shook. They turned, in the smoke. They turned, and the sky opened, and the virus came. And now there is only this. A gesture, small and terrible, at the geology of the dead, 50,000 of us, more, loyal to the last, murdered by our own blood. And you climb out of them, wearing that face, carrying that blade, and you ask me who did this. War was silent for a long moment. Ash sifted down between them, soft as snow, gray as grief. I climbed out of them, War said, because I was thrown into them. I did not choose this ground. I did not make this war. An hour ago I stood before things that call themselves the judges of all creation, and they showed me a galaxy eating itself, and they said, ride in, and judge it. He looked down at the bolter still trained on his heart and did not move it aside. I have judged a great many things. I have never judged anything that deserved it more than the ones who built this. Something shifted in the dying man's ruined face. Not trust. He was far past trust, and War had not earned it and did not ask for it. But a soldier knows the sound of another soldier's truth, even across the gulf between a loyalist of the Legiones Astartes and a Nephilim rider of an ended world, and the loyalist heard it now. The bolter did not lower, but the finger came off the trigger, by a fraction. You talk, the loyalist rasped, like something that means to fight them. I mean to weigh them, War said. And if the weighing goes the way I think it will, yes, I mean to fight them. He crouched, then, bringing his red iron bulk down to the level of the dying giant, and the pressure of him, the sheer wrongness of a thing not born of this reality, should have made the loyalist recoil. It did not. The loyalist had seen the warp's horrors up close, and whatever this was, it did not feel like them. It felt like iron. It felt like the thing the warp horrors were afraid of. Tell me their names, War said. The father, the betrayer, the 4 the traitors paint on their armor. Tell me the shape of this war soldier, so that when I judge it true, and not with the ignorance of a stranger. And the loyalist, with the last hour of his life, buried in his murdered legion under a poisoned sky, telling his testimony not to a chaplain or a captain, but to a red giant with a black sword, who might have been a daemon, and might have been the only honest thing left on the whole dead world, told him. He told him of the Emperor, the father of them all, the deathless will on a distant throne who had lifted mankind out of 10,000 years of darkness and forbidden them their gods. He told him of the Great Crusade, of the galaxy reconquered star by star, of the 20 legions and the 20 Primarch sons sculpted from the Father's own flesh to lead them. He told him, his voice fraying, his body failing, but the words coming faster now, as if he had to empty himself of the truth before he died. Of Horus, the War Master, best beloved, first among the sons, who had been given the whole crusade to command, and had turned it into a knife aimed at his father's heart. He told him of the 4 hungers, the ruinous powers, the gods of the warp who had whispered the War Master into treason and now wore his legions like a costume. And he told him of Istvan, of the loyal 3 legions lured down onto the black sands, and the traitor 3 who marched beside them wearing the mask of loyalty, and the moment in the smoke and shellfire when the mask came off and brother opened fire on brother, and the sky itself vomited plague. That is the war, the loyalist finished, and there was almost nothing left of his voice. A father and his sons, the greatest thing men ever built, cutting its own throat, because they, the 4, reached in and twisted. His eye found wars, and held it, and there was a question in it that the dying often carry, and rarely get to ask. So daemon, judge, whatever you are, now that you know, now that you've heard it, a breath, ragged, final. How do you weigh us? War considered the question with the seriousness it was owed. He looked at the strata of the loyal dead, murdered for their faith in a father who had already been outmaneuvered by gods. He looked at the poisoned sky and thought of the brass throne on its mountain of skulls, the throne that rose higher with every death on this world, and understood that the massacre beneath his feet was not the tragedy of this war but the fuel of it, that even now, the four hungers were feasting on the 50,000 loyal dead and growing fat, and that the men who had died loyal had, in dying, made their enemies' gods stronger. It was the cruelest arithmetic War had ever seen. In his own war, the fallen at least stayed spent. Here, the dead were a harvest. I weigh you, War said slowly, as a man betrayed, not damned, not a coward, not a fool, a soldier who kept faith while the ground opened under him, and died cursing the dark instead of joining it. He reached out, slowly, so the dying man could see the movement, and closed his great gauntlet over the loyalist's ruined hand where it still held the bolter, and he did not take the weapon away. He held it, steadied it, let the soldier die armed. That is how I weigh you, War said. As the one thing in this crater the gods could not eat. You died loyal, and it changed nothing, and it was still worth doing. Remember that, if there is anywhere for you to remember it. In a galaxy with no balance, you were the only weight on the true side of the scale. The loyalist's eye held his a moment longer, and then, perhaps it was the ashlight, perhaps it was only the last slackening of a body that had held on past all reason to spit at hell one final time. Something in the ruined face eased, not peace. There was no peace to be had here, but the flat refusal of the last day gave way, for one breath, to something almost like being seen. Then weigh them, the loyalist said. The War Master, the four, all of them, the bolter, steadied in war's grip, did not waver now. Weigh them, Judge, and find them. He did not finish. The last of him went out between one word and the next, quietly, the way a candle goes when the room has been cold a long time. The eye stopped burning. The hand went slack in War's gauntlet. And War knelt in the crater of the 50,000 loyal dead, on a black sand world whose name he would never learn, holding a dead man's bolter and the shape of a galaxy's whole betrayal. And he did not move for a long time. Above him, the poisoned sky churned. Somewhere beyond it, on that mountain of brass, a throne rose one skull higher on the strength of everything that had died here. And War, alone, unmet by his brothers or his sister, without his steed or the council's writ, or any authority in all this galaxy save the black blade in his fist, and the verdict forming cold and certain in his chest, rose again out of the dead. Loyal, he said to the corpse, and to the crater, and to the 50,000. I heard you. Then he turned his face toward the churning dark where the war was, and began to walk, one rider, on foot, into the greatest fratricide the galaxy had ever known, carrying a verdict he had every intention of delivering in full. Far off, on the edge of hearing, something that was not the wind began to laugh. It had smelled him now, a soul like his, wandering alone across a killing ground. The gods of this galaxy did not let such things walk unclaimed. War heard the laughter, and did not slow. Come then, he said, let us weigh you too. Death landed on a world that was already his. The seam spat him out over a planet the color of a week-old wound, and he fell through a sky thick with spores and the fat lazy flies that should not have been able to fly at that altitude and did anyway. And he landed without sound in a marsh that had, until recently, been a city. He rose out of the black water the way a memory rises, unhurried, inevitable, and dust settled back onto his shoulder from wherever the crow went when the world tore, and death looked upon the graveyard world of the Death Guard's making, and felt, for the first time since the council flung him, something almost like recognition. He knew rot, he was its brother. He had walked the kingdom of the dead when it was young, and he had reaped his own kin under a bleeding sky, and he had made a study, across ages, of the exact grammar of ending, how a thing dies, and what it becomes, and what refuses to stay ended. This world spoke that grammar, but it spoke it wrong, and the wrongness was what made the pale rider go still in the black marsh and listen. Death understood death. This was not death. This was death denied, A whole world dying and dying and never permitted to finish, its corpses swollen with a false and buzzing vitality, its plague pits fermenting, its dead men walking with grins carved into faces that had rotted past the point of grinning. The trees wept a sap that healed nothing and preserved everything. The very flies were joyful. It was a garden. Someone had made a garden of an ending, and had taught the ending to be grateful. Nurgle, Death said, to no one, tasting the name the council's mirror had given him, the grandfather, the god of plague and decay, and the terrible love that keeps a rotting thing alive past all mercy. And Death, who had reaped more than any being in creation, who understood that ending was not cruelty but balance, the necessary and honest cost of having lived, looked upon a god who had made ending into imprisonment, and felt the closest thing to disgust his ancient nature permitted. There was a philosophy in Death, hard won across an existence spent as creation's executioner. He killed, yes, he had killed his own kind, but he killed clean, a reaping, a release. The door opened so the thing that had lived could pass through it and be done. What Nurgle had built here was the opposite of a reaping. It was a door nailed shut with love, a whole world of souls held in the vestibule of ending and told to be thankful for the buzzing warmth. To a reaper, it was an obscenity. To Death, specifically, it was a heresy against the only law he had ever truly served, that everything ends, and the ending is holy, and to deny it is the one unforgivable thing. So when the plague god's attention found him, and it found him quickly, for a rider of death walking through Nurgle's own garden lit up the warp like a lantern in a crypt, the grandfather did not find what it expected. Nurgle expected a kindred thing. It had felt Death's arrival and rejoiced, in its vast, doting, generous way, because here at last was a soul that understood, a walker among the dead, an intimate of rot, a being who had made ending his whole vocation. Surely, the grandfather reasoned, in the warm, slow way it reasoned, this pale rider would be the easiest of the four to embrace. Offer him the garden, offer him the end of loneliness, a god who loved the dead as he did, a family of the rotting and the grateful, an eternity where nothing ever truly had to end and so nothing ever had to be mourned. The gods had felt Death's crime, the fratricide he carried, and Nurgle, who specialized in the tender exploitation of grief, reached for that wound with all the terrible gentleness of a plague that only wants to keep you. You who have killed your own, the grandfather crooned, and the whole world crooned with it, the flies and the weeping trees and the grinning dead lifting their voices in a wet chorus of welcome. You who carry them, set it down, child. Here, nothing dies and so nothing is lost. Here, your kin need never have been reaped. Here you may keep them, and keep everything, forever, in the warm. No more endings, no more grief, only the garden, and the love that does not let go. Come home. Death listened to the whole of it, patiently, the way he listened to everything. Then he began to walk toward the source of the chorus, and as he walked he drew both harvester blades, and the false vitality of Nurgle's garden began, for the first time in a very long time, to die. It happened in his footprints first. Where the pale rider stepped, the buzzing stopped. The joyful flies fell out of the air and stayed fallen. The grinning dead men who lurched toward him with their arms open in the garden's welcome simply ended. He did not hack them. He did not need to. Death passed his hand near one of the shambling corpses, and the corpse remembered, at last, that it was supposed to be dead, and the false life went out of it like breath from a punctured bellows, and it lay down in the marsh, and was, finally, still. Around each fallen thing, a small clean silence spread. Not decay, not corruption, just the honest quiet of something permitted, at long last, to be over. "What are you doing?" said the grandfather, and for the first time the crooning had an edge under it. "These are mine. These are loved. You unmake my garden." "I end it," Death said. He did not raise his voice. He never did. "You have taken the one mercy the dying are owed and turned it into a cage. You call it love. I have reaped 10,000 generations and I know what love is owed the dead. It is the door. It is the going. It is not this, a gesture with a harvester at the weeping, grateful, imprisoned world. This endless buzzing gratitude of things that were never allowed to leave. You have made your garden out of stolen endings, and I am the collector of debts. He reached a rise in the marsh, and from it he looked down upon the heart of the plague world, and there, vast, patient, wreathed in flies, leaning on a great war scythe of his own, stood the reason the garden existed, not the god's most favored son, Mortarion. The Primarch of the Death Guard was a giant even among giants, gaunt and gray and towering, his flesh long since surrendered to the grandfather's gifts, his lungs a bellows of poison, his eyes two coals of exhausted resentment above the rebreather that let him keep on suffering. He had come to this world to consecrate it, to plant another garden in his father's dying galaxy, one more monument to the only bargain that had ever eased his endless pain. And he had felt the Pale Rider unmaking his god's work step by step across the marsh, and he had come down to the front personally, war scythe silence in his fist, to see what manner of thing dared reap in the grandfather's own house. The two of them regarded each other across the ruined garden, the Primarch of undying decay, and the Rider whose whole existence was the honest ending decay refused to allow. It would be difficult to imagine two beings more opposed, or two beings who understood each other more immediately. Mortarion had spent his whole cursed life trying to escape death, first on his poison homeworld, then in his father's war, and at last in Nurgle's warm, imprisoning embrace that promised he would never have to end. And here was death itself, walked into his garden on two legs, patient and pale and entirely unafraid. "You are the thing the whispers speak of," Mortarion said. His voice was a graveyard wind through a broken pipe, one of the four souls the gods have set the whole galaxy hunting, the Reaper. Something moved behind the exhausted eyes. Not fear, Mortarion was long past fear, but a bone-deep weariness that recognized a fellow traveler and hated him for it. "You unmake the grandfather's mercy, you kill his garden." "Mercy," Death repeated, and there was no scorn in it, which made it worse. "Is that what you call the thing that keeps you breathing poison 10,000 years past, when you should have been let go?" He looked at the Primarch, really looked, the way Death looked at everything he was about to reap or refuse to, and saw the whole shape of Mortarion in a glance. The child who fled a dying world, the son who never trusted a father, the giant who had chosen the plague god not out of malice but out of the oldest terror there is, the terror of the ending, dressed up as a bargain. And Death, who had every reason to hold this traitor Primarch in contempt, felt instead the thing he felt most often and showed least, a vast, cold, and entirely genuine pity. "You are not a monster," Death told the Death Lord, quietly, across the ruined marsh. "You are afraid. You have been afraid your whole long life, of the one thing that comes for everything, and a god found your fear and sold you a cage and called it a cure. That is not strength, Mortarion. That is not even damnation. It is only a very old, very tired child, refusing to go to sleep." The war scythe silence came up, and the Primarch's exhausted eyes kindled into something like rage, because the thing about a truth is that it wounds precisely in proportion to how true it is, and Death had just spoken the truest thing anyone had said to Mortarion in 10,000 years. "I will not be reaped," Mortarion snarled, and the whole plague world snarled with him, the grandfather rising in the warp behind his favored son, in a wall of buzzing wrath. "I chose this. I chose never to end, and you will not walk into my garden and preach the door to me, Reaper, as though the door is a kindness. I have seen the door. My whole homeworld was the door. I climbed out of it once and I will never go back through." He came, then, and Mortarion in his wrath was a thing to freeze the blood, a Primarch, a demigod general, wreathed in his god's full favor, silence howling as it clove the poisoned air. In this galaxy he had killed Astartes by the 100 and terror troops without number. He was, by any measure this galaxy could take, a god's own instrument of war. But the thing he swung his scythe at was not of this galaxy, and did not answer to its measures. The iron law held. Death did not slow, and did not lose a fraction of what he was to Nurgle's favor, or Mortarion's might, or the plague world's massed hostility, because none of it was death magic that could touch a Reaper. None of it was the soul corruption that needed a hollow he did not have, and the grandfather's poisons found nothing in Death to sicken. What came at him was a giant with a great scythe, and Death had been reaping giants with scythes since before this galaxy's stars were lit, and he met Mortarion's silence with his own two harvesters, in a crossing that rang across the marsh like a bell struck in a tomb. They fought, briefly and terribly, and it was not a fight the way this galaxy understood fighting. It was closer to an argument conducted in blades, the undying against the ending, the caged against the door, decay's champion against decay's honest master. And in the crossing of it, death did not seek to kill the Primarch, though he could have opened him from throat to hip, because death did not reap what he had not judged, and he had not finished judging Mortarion. He fought him to a standstill, to a truth, to the exact edge of ending, and then he stopped, both harvesters at rest, and let the Primarch feel how close the door had come, and how easily it could have opened. There, death said, into the shocked silence. You felt it. For one moment, you felt the door. And do you know what I saw in your eyes when it came close? He lowered the blades. Not terror, relief. Some buried, exhausted part of you, under 10,000 years of the grandfather's love, was glad. Because you are tired, Mortarion. You have been tired since your homeworld. And the cage your god built you is not rest. It is only more of the same suffering, forever, with a smile carved on. The Primarch stood frozen, silence trembling in his grip, and the warp roiled around him as the grandfather howled at its favored son to strike, unmake the Reaper, and for one long, terrible private moment, Mortarion did not strike. Because the Reaper was right, and both of them knew it, and the knowing hung in the poisoned air between them like the last honest thing on a world built entirely of lies. Then Nurgle's love closed over its son again, warm and total and merciless, and the moment drowned. Mortarion's eyes went dull with the old surrender. "Get off my world, Reaper," he said, and it came out almost as a plea. "Go find your kin, and your judgment, and your door. I made my bargain. I will not unmake it for a truth." He turned, then, turned his gaunt gray back on death, which no enemy in this galaxy had ever survived doing, and walked back into the buzzing embrace of his garden. "But I will not hunt you," he said, without turning. "Let the others race for the god's prize. I have seen what you are. I would sooner leave the door alone than open it and find you standing on the other side." Death watched the Death Lord go, and did not stop him, and did not follow. "You will meet the door regardless," Death said quietly, to the retreating gray giant, and to the whole grateful, imprisoned world. "Everything does. That is not cruelty, Mortarion. It is the only mercy there has ever been. And when it comes for you, as it will, bargain or no bargain, for even the grandfather's garden ends, I hope some tired, honest part of you is still glad." Then the Pale Rider turned from the Plague World's heart and walked back the way he had come, and in his footprints, the false life kept dying. Small, clean silences blooming across the marsh, 100,000 imprisoned dead permitted at last, in the narrow wake of his passing, to finally be still. Dust shifted on his shoulder and made a low sound, and Death answered it as he answered the crow, which was the only conversation he truly kept. 3 others, he agreed, somewhere in this galaxy that has forgotten how to end things. He looked up, past the spores and the fat, joyful flies, toward the churning warp where 4 hungers watched him with a covetousness that had, in the last hour, curdled into something colder. Let them race for us. Let them reach. The mask tilted, and behind it, for just a moment, something that was almost a smile. They think they are the harvest, and we the prize. They have never met a reaper who was not for sale. And behind him, the grandfather of plagues, the god who loved all his rotting children and never, ever let them go, looked upon a soul it could not tempt with the end of grief, because that soul had already made its peace with grief, and made a vocation of the door, and Nurgle felt, beneath its vast and doting patience, the first cold seep of the thing gods are not supposed to feel. It had reached for a prize, and the prize had looked at its garden, and named it a cage, and walked out untouched, and disappointed. 400 light-years from the Black Sands, in the belly of a battle barge whose hull was carved with 10,000 pages of a heretic gospel, Lorgar Aurelian felt the newcomers arrive the way a man feels a change in the weather in an old wound. He had been at prayer. He was almost always at prayer now. The Primarch who had been humbled at Monarchia for worshipping his father as a god, and who had found, in his humiliation, gods that were real and hungered back. The Word-Bearer's fleet hung in the void around a dying world, and in the great reliquary chapel at the heart of the Fidelitas Lex Lorgar knelt before an altar to the Pantheon, his golden skin inscribed with litanies in a script that hurt mortal eyes, and he was speaking to the four he had given his soul, and his legion, and his father's whole crusade to serve. They spoke back, as they always did now, and in the middle of the communion they flinched. Lorgar's eyes opened. He had never felt the gods flinch. He had felt them rage, gloat, hunger, scheme, laugh. The four voices braided into the one great voice of chaos that had filled the hollow the Emperor's rejection had carved in him. But this was new. This was a sudden, ravenous, startled interest, four appetites turning as one toward something that had just fallen into the galaxy. And under the interest, this was the part that made the Primarch rise slowly to his feet. Under it ran a thin, cold thread that Lorgar, master theologian of the warp, had learned to recognize in himself, and had never once felt in his gods. Uncertainty. Cor Phaeron, he said, and his equerry father, the twisted old zealot who had raised him, was already there, having felt the shift in the ship's warp-saturated air. Erebus, attend me. Erebus came, smooth and smiling, the archpriest whose whispers had turned Horus, whose fingerprints were on every wound in this war. He was, of all the beings in the galaxy, perhaps the most fluent in the will of the ruinous powers, and he wore that fluency like a courtier wears a blade. But even Erebus was not smiling in quite his usual way. He had felt it too. You felt them, Lorgar said. It was not a question. Four souls, Erebus said, entering the materium, perhaps an hour ago. Scattered. The crossing tore them apart. They landed leagues and light years from one another. He paused, and for once the pause was not theatrical. My lord, in all my communions, I have never tasted souls like these. They are not of this galaxy. They are not of the warp. They are not. He searched for it, and the great warp scholar of the word-bearers came up short. They are not shaped the way souls are shaped. They are older than that, and the gods want them. All four gods, at once, the same four. That was the thing. That was the thing that had brought Lorgar to his feet and would soon bring the whole legion to war. The four ruinous powers did not agree. Their entire nature was to compete. Khorne's slaughter against Slaanesh's excess, Nurgle's stagnation against Tzeentch's endless change, and the genius of Lorgar's dark theology had been to hold them in a single balanced pantheon, precisely because they could never truly cooperate. But now, for the first time Lorgar had ever known, the four hungers were unanimous. Each of them wanted one of the strangers, and each of them wanted the other three claimed too, because a soul that rich, left in the hands of a rival god, was intolerable to all of them. They are riders, said a fourth voice, and it came from the deep shadow of the reliquary chapel where Cor Phaeron stood, and the old man's ruined eyes were fixed on nothing, which meant they were fixed on the warp. The gods show me their shapes, four riders of an ended world, executioners of their own kind. They came to judge us. He laughed, a dry and dreadful sound, to judge the galaxy, as though there were still a scale left to weigh it on. Lorgar turned the word over. Judge. He had spent his life among judgments, his father's judgment at Monarchia that had broken him, his own judgment upon the imperial truth that had unmade his faith, the judgment of the gods he now served. And here came four strangers out of nowhere, carrying the presumption of judgment into the middle of the greatest reckoning in the galaxy's history, and Lorgar Aurelian, prophet, Primarch, the first and most devout of the traitors, felt the whole architecture of his purpose shiver with a terrible, seductive possibility. You misread the gods' fear, Erebus, Lorgar said softly. It is not fear that these judges might stop us. Four riders, scattered, against the war of a galaxy. No. The gods do not fear them. He began to pace, golden and radiant, the litanies on his skin flickering with reflected candle fire. The gods covet them, and they are uncertain, because they do not yet know how to take them. These are not mortal souls to be tempted with a whispered promise. They are not primarchs to be turned over decades of poison. They are something the warp has never digested before, and the gods have realized, all four at once, that whoever brings these four souls into the pantheon will have offered the ruinous powers the greatest gift since the fall of the Eldari. He stopped and turned, and his eyes were alight with the awful joy of a prophet who has just been handed a new revelation. New gods, Erebus, 4 riders, rich beyond any soul in this galaxy, made ascendant, seated in the warp beside the 4. Imagine it. Imagine the legion that delivered them. Erebus understood, then, and the smile came back, wider and hungrier than before. The word-bearers, he breathed. Not merely the vanguard of the War Master's rebellion, the midwives of a new pantheon. The gods have set every faithful soul in the galaxy hunting them now. Corfaron rasped from his shadow. The whisper is going out. Every warband, every cultist, every daemon with the wit to hear it. 4 souls, scattered, to be taken. It will be a war within the war. Everything that serves the pantheon will be racing for them. Then we race faster, Lorgar said, and we race smarter. The others will hunt these riders like game, try to cage them, kill them, drag them screaming into the warp. And they will fail, because you do not cage a thing that judges. You do not drag it, you convert it. His voice dropped into the register that had turned an entire legion into apostles. The voice that had once nearly turned the galaxy to the worship of a father, who did not want it, and now bent all its terrible persuasion toward the gods who did. These riders came to judge a galaxy with no balance. I will show them there is a balance, that the 4 hungers are the balance, the great and honest truth this galaxy's corpse-worshipping imperium denies. I will not fight them. I will preach to them. And when a judge is made to see that the thing he came to condemn is in truth the only order left in creation, Lorgar spread his tattooed hands. He does not condemn it, he joins it, and he ascends. There was a silence in the reliquary chapel, thick with incense and warp pressure, and the terrible plausibility of a Primarch's certainty. It was Erebus, of all of them, who found the flaw. Erebus, who had spent longer in the gods' confidence than any, and had learned to listen for the note of a plan that would come apart. And if they will not be preached to, my lord, he asked, silken. You did not see what I felt in the crossing. These are not seekers. The one the gods want most, the pale one, the eldest. I brushed against his soul for a heartbeat, and it was like putting my hand against a door with something behind it that has killed more of its own kind than the 4 of us have killed of mankind. There is no hollow in him for a god to fill, no hunger for a whisper to feed, no pride to flatter, no despair to rot, no fear to twist. He has already done the worst thing a soul can do, and he carries it, Lorgar. He carries it awake, every hour, and it has not broken him, and it has not tempted him. That is not a soul you convert. The smile was gone again. That is a soul that walks into the warp, looks the gods in their appetites, and judges them. For a moment, just a moment, the uncertainty Lorgar had felt in his gods flickered across the Primarch's own golden face. Then he mastered it, as he mastered all doubt now, by folding it into faith. Then the Pale One is the test, Lorgar said. Convert the others, the wrathful Red One, the proud huntress, the cynical gunman. Souls with edges the gods can catch. Bring 3 of the 4 into the pantheon, and the 4th, the Pale Judge, will find himself alone in a galaxy that has swallowed his family whole, and a judge with no one left to stand beside him. The prophet's voice was very soft now, very sure, and very cruel. Is a judge who begins, at last, to wonder whether he has been judging the wrong things all along. He turned to the great warp-scoured window of the reliquary chapel, where the dying world below turned slow and red beneath the guns of his fleet, and he raised his tattooed hands to the 4 hungers that had, for the first time in his service, spoken with one voice. Hear me, Lorgar Aurelian prayed, and every candle in the vast chapel guttered as the warp leaned in to listen. You have shown me the prize, and I have understood it. 4 thrones stand empty in the pantheon to come, and the word-bearers will fill them. Give me the wrathful one to offer to the skull throne. Give me the huntress to the prince of pleasure. Give me the schemer's ally to the architect of fate, and let even the grandfather have his rider. And the eldest, the pale judge, the one with no hollow in him. Lorgar smiled, and it was the smile of a man who had made a career of the impossible conversion. Give him to me. Let me be the one to show him that in a galaxy with no balance, the only honest gods are the hungry ones. Let me convert the executioner of an ended world, and let the word-bearers be remembered. when this war is won, and the corpse on the golden throne is dust, as the legion that gave the warp 4 new gods. And in the warp, the 4 hungers heard the prayer of their most faithful son, and were pleased, and were uncertain still, because they, unlike Lorgar, had felt the full weight of what had entered their galaxy, and they knew, in the deep and ancient part of them that had eaten 100,000 civilizations, that a soul which cannot be tempted is not a prize. It is a threat. But greed is greed, even among gods, and the 4 hungers were the greediest things in all creation, and so they did what greed always does. They reached. Across 400 light years, on a black sand world choked with the loyal dead, a red iron rider walking alone toward the war felt the reaching, felt 4 vast appetites turn their attention fully upon him at last, and war stopped, and lifted his head, and gripped Chaos Eater, and spoke to gods who had eaten galaxies as though they were errant children caught reaching for a blade. "There you are," War said. "I wondered when you'd come." And far away, in his reliquary chapel, Lorgar Aurelian felt his gods recoil a second time from the Red Rider's soul, and the Primarch's certainty wavered a third time, before, as always, faith swallowed the doubt whole, and the word-bearers turned their entire dark apparatus toward the hunt for 4 scattered souls, racing a galaxy of rivals for the greatest prize the warp had ever craved. The war within the war had begun, and not one of the hunters yet understood that they were not the predators in it. Fury arrived in a palace, and the palace was the most beautiful thing she had ever wanted to burn. The seam set her down, almost gently, which she distrusted immediately, in a gallery that ran longer than the eye could follow, a corridor of such perfect proportion that the mind kept trying to find a flaw in it, just to have something to hold on to, and could not. The floor was a single seamless sheet of some pale stone polished to a depthless mirror. The walls held art, sculpture, canvas, things that were neither and moved slightly when she did not look directly at them. Light fell from no visible source at exactly the angle to flatter every surface, and over all of it hung a scent, perfume and incense, and something underneath, something sweetish and wrong, like flowers arranged over meat. Fury landed in a crouch, scorn already uncoiling from her hip, her white flame hair flaring, and she understood before she had fully risen that she had been dropped into the one place in this whole galaxy, specifically designed to unmake a soul like hers, because Fury knew pride. Fury had been pride, the proudest of the 4, the one who had come apart on her own vanity and had to walk into the fire of it and burn away everything she loved about herself to become something true. She had conquered her pride at a cost her brothers would never fully understand, and the victory had left her permanently, exquisitely sensitive to the thing in its every form. And this gallery, this endless, flattering, perfect corridor with its moving art and its meat-sweet perfume, was pride weaponized, pride-made architecture, a place built by something that had made the pursuit of perfection into a god, and worshipped it, and been eaten by it, and called the eating transcendence. "Slaanesh," she said, and the name tasted of the perfume. "You know the prince already," said a voice, and it was the most beautiful voice Fury had ever heard, and she wanted to cut its throat on principle. "How disappointing. I had hoped to be your introduction." He came down the endless gallery toward her, and he was perfect, and that was the horror of him. Fulgrim, Primarch of the Emperor's children, the Phoenician, silver-haired, flawless, moving with a grace that made the perfect gallery look clumsy by comparison. He had once been the most gifted of all the Emperor's sons, the pursuit of perfection made flesh, and he had chased that perfection straight into the arms of the Prince of Pleasure, and been remade into something that wore his beauty like a lure over a hook. He smiled at her, and the smile was warm and knowing, and utterly without a flaw, and Fury, who had spent an age learning to read exactly this, saw the demon behind the Primarch's eyes wearing the Primarch like a glove. "A huntress," Fulgrim purred, circling her with the frank appreciation of a collector who has just found something rare. "A creature of fire and pride and such, magnificent self-possession. Do you know, I felt you arrive the way one feels a masterpiece uncrated. The gods have set the whole galaxy scrambling for you and your kin, all of them frothing and grasping, and here I find you delivered to my very own gallery, as though the prince meant you for me specifically." He tilted his flawless head. And perhaps it did. We are alike, you and I. I can feel it. The reaching, the hunger for the higher thing, the refusal to be ordinary. We are not alike, Fury said. No. Fulgrim gestured at the endless gallery, the moving art, the impossible proportion. I have refined myself past every limit mankind was born into. I have felt sensations no mortal nervous system could survive. I have made my very existence a work of art. And you, his eyes traveled over her, the flame hair, the coiled whip, the serpent grace. You carry yourself like something that knows it is superior to everything around it, and is merely being polite about it. That is not humility, Huntress. I know humility's face, and you are not wearing it. That is pride so total it no longer needs to announce itself. That is pride that has become poise. The smile widened. We are exactly alike. I simply had the courage to follow it all the way home. And there was the hook, and Fury felt it set. And the terrible thing was that it was not entirely a lie, because he was close. That was what made him dangerous. Not the flattery. Flattery she could have spat on. It was that Fulgrim had looked at her and seen something real. The pride that survived her conquest of pride. The poise that was pride's honest residue. The part of her that did, still, in some deep unkillable place, believe herself superior to almost everything she met. She had not burned that away in the fire of her vanity. She had learned to carry it without being ruled by it, which was a different and harder thing than being free of it. And Fulgrim, connoisseur of exactly this, had put his flawless finger on the exact place where she was still, and would always be, vulnerable. The Prince of Pleasure leaned into the opening its champion had made. Fury felt it, the warp itself leaning in, the perfume thickening, the gallery arranging itself into ever more perfect proportion around her, every surface whispering the same seductive syllogism, you are superior. Superiority deserves its reward. Here is a god who will give you every sensation, every refinement, every recognition your excellence has earned and the world has denied. You have carried your pride so long and so nobly. Why not, at last, let it be worshipped? It was the single most sophisticated temptation Fury had ever faced, and she stood in the middle of it, whip in hand, flame hair guttering, and felt the old vanity stir in her chest like a coal she had thought long dead, and she began, very quietly, to laugh. Fulgrim's flawless smile flickered. It was not the reaction the gallery had been designed to produce. You think this is new to me, Fury said, and the laugh had an edge to it now, and the edge was scorn's edge. You think you found the crack in me, and set your beautiful hook in it, and you have. That's the thing you don't understand, Phoenician. You have. That coal you're blowing on is real. The pride is still in me. It always will be. I know exactly the superiority you're describing, because I feel it, standing here, looking at your endless flattering gallery and your perfect ruined face, and some part of me does think I am better than all of it. She took a step toward him, and the gallery's perfect light seemed, for the first time, to flinch. You think that's your victory. It's the opposite, because I have already walked into that fire, Primarch. I have already stood in the middle of my own vanity, with everything I loved about myself burning around me, and I did not let it eat me. I burned it, and I kept walking, and I came out the other side carrying the coal instead of being consumed by it. You had the same fire. You had the exact same fire. And you did the opposite. You looked at your pride and you called it home, and you crawled inside and let it wear you like a glove. Her voice dropped, and it was almost gentle, and that was the cruelest thing she could have done to him. That's the difference between us, Fulgrim. Not that I don't have the pride, that I survived it. And you beautiful, brilliant, wasted thing, you didn't. The gallery's perfect light stuttered. The moving art froze. And for one instant, one single instant, something looked out of Fulgrim's flawless eyes that was not the demon and was not the Phoenician's dark joy, but the thing trapped underneath both, the original Fulgrim, the true one, the son who had loved perfection honestly before the prince made a marionette of him, and who was still in there somewhere, screaming, behind his own beautiful face. Fury saw it. She had a hunter's eye, and she saw the prisoner in the flawless cell, and for a heartbeat her contempt curdled into something almost unbearable. Pity. for the worst possible thing to pity, a demigod worn like a costume by the very sin he'd chased. Then the Prince of Pleasure noticed her seeing, and slammed the cell shut, and Fulgrim's face was flawless and empty and hungry again, and the moment was gone. "You wound beautifully," the Daemon Primarch said, and the warmth was gone from the perfect voice, and what remained was colder and older and far less human. "I will grant you that. The prince does so love a thing with edges. But you mistake your situation, Huntress. This is not a gallery you may lecture me in and then leave. This is my domain, in my God's favor, and you are one soul, alone, scattered from your kin, standing in the exact center of the Prince of Pleasure's reaching hand." The perfect gallery began, very slowly, to close, the endless corridor folding inward, the walls with their moving art sliding nearer, the perfume thickening toward something narcotic and total. The gods want you, all four, and I have you. Do you truly imagine I mean to debate you into the pantheon? No, no. I mean to keep you, to refine you, to take that magnificent unbroken pride and, sensation by sensation, refinement by refinement, over years if it must be years, to teach you what I learned. That the fire is not something to survive, it is something to surrender to. And you will surrender, Huntress. Everything does, here, even masterpieces, especially masterpieces. And the Prince of Pleasure closed its hand. The gallery came alive. The moving art tore itself off the walls. Daemonettes, sinuous and razor-clawed, and singing in a register that reached past the ears and into the base of the spine. The beautiful screaming children of the sixth god, pouring toward fury from every impossible angle of the folding corridor. The perfume became a weight, a drug, a syrup meant to slow the blood and soften the will. And Fulgrim came with them, drawing a blade that had drunk a Primarch's soul, moving with the killing grace that had ended better swordsmen than this galaxy would ever make. Fury stopped laughing, and scorn came off her hip in a line of fire. Here, too, the iron law held, because Slaanesh's whole art was the seduction of the flesh and the corruption of desire. And Fury's flesh was not this galaxy's flesh, and her desire had already been through the fire, and out the other side. The narcotic perfume found no purchase in lungs that were not built for it. The song that reached into mortal spines found nothing to grip in a Nephilim who had already conquered the exact hunger it sang to. The prince could make a mortal drown in sensation. It could not make Fury feel anything her own mastered pride did not permit her to feel. And so what should have been a slow, exquisite unmaking became, instead, a fight. And Fury, unlike a mortal soul, was very, very good at fighting in a burning room. Scorn was a whip of pure force, and she wielded it like the extension of her own contempt that it was. The Daemonettes came singing, and she answered them in fire, the lash cracking through the perfect air, each strike unmaking one of the prince's beautiful children and sending it howling back into the warp. She moved through the folding gallery in a spiral of flame and force, and where she moved, Slaanesh's perfect proportion broke, cracked, buckled, the flawless mirror floor spiderwebbing under her heel, the narcotic light guttering, the whole weaponized pride architecture failing to hold a soul it had been built to seduce, and could only, now, try to kill. Fulgrim reached her in the center of the collapsing gallery, and their blades met, his soul-drinking sword against her whip of fire. And for a span of heartbeats the Huntress and the Phoenician fought at a speed and a level this galaxy had no witnesses fit to describe. He was a Primarch, a demigod, one of the deadliest swordsmen ever forged. She was a horseman of the apocalypse who had crossed blades with the champions of heaven and hell both. They were, for those heartbeats, genuinely matched. And then Fury did the thing Fulgrim could not, because it required the one quality he had traded away. She stopped caring about doing it beautifully. He fought like an artist, every stroke perfect, every motion a refinement, because that was all he had left, the perfection that had eaten him. She fought like something that only wanted to win, and had long ago burned away the vanity that would have made her fight to look magnificent doing it. And in the gap between the two, between the swordsman who needed his killing to be beautiful, and the Huntress who had conquered exactly that need, Fury found the opening, and Scorn wrapped his sword arm in a line of fire, and she wrenched, and the soul-drinking blade spun away across the shattering mirror floor, and the Phoenician stood disarmed in the wreck of his own perfect gallery for the first time in 10,000 years. She did not kill him. She could have. She stood over the disarmed Primarch with scorn drawn back and the whole collapsing domain of the Prince of Pleasure guttering around them, and she looked into his flawless face and saw, again, for just a moment, the prisoner screaming behind it. And she made the choice her brother had made on the Plague World, the choice that separated the horsemen from everything that hunted them. She judged, and she stayed her hand. "I'm not going to kill you, Fulgrim," Fury said, and she was not even breathing hard, and that was its own kind of verdict. "Killing you would be a mercy, and you haven't earned mercy, and neither has the thing wearing you. I'm going to leave you exactly as you are, disarmed in the ruin of your beautiful gallery, wearing the pride you crawled into, worn like a glove by a god you called transcendence." She began to walk away, through the shattered art and the guttering light, toward the far end of the collapsing corridor, where the seam's residue still shimmered faintly, a door out. "You wanted to teach me what you learned in the fire, so let me teach you what I learned. The pride was never the enemy. Everyone has it. The failure isn't feeling superior. The failure is needing to be worshipped for it. You needed the worship. You found a god that would give it to you. And now you're a masterpiece in a cage, and you'll never make anything real again, because everything you make now is only ever a mirror for your own beautiful ruined face." At the door she paused, and looked back one last time at the Phoenician kneeling in his broken gallery, and the daemon behind his eyes, and the prisoner behind the daemon. "The real one's still in there," she said quietly, and it was almost kind, and it was the deepest cut of all. "I saw him. When I told you the truth, he looked out at me for a second. He's still in there, Fulgrim, awake, watching you wear his face, and call it transcendence. That's your eternity. Not pleasure, not perfection. Being a prisoner in your own beautiful skull, forever, watching a god make art out of your corpse." She stepped through the door. Slanesh should have picked something with less of him left. There's nothing crueler than a cage you're still awake inside of. And Fury walked out of the domain of the Prince of Pleasure into the void between war worlds, leaving the collapse behind her. One soul the sixth god had reached for with its most perfect lure and failed to hold. Because you cannot seduce a thing that has already been through the fire your seduction is only a picture of. Behind her, in the wreck of the gallery, the Prince of Pleasure withdrew its shattered hand from real space, and felt, for the first time in the long history of its hunger, the singular humiliation of having offered a soul everything, and been told, with genuine pity, that everything was not enough, because the soul had already learned the one truth that made the offer worthless. And in the prison of his own flawless skull, the true Fulgrim, the son, the artist, the one who had loved perfection before it ate him, watched the huntress go, and for the first time in 10,000 years, in the deepest and most silent cell of himself, something that had long ago stopped being able to hope felt, faintly, unbearably, seen. Strife landed in an argument, which suited him, because Strife had never once in his long existence met a situation he couldn't talk his way deeper into. The scene dropped him onto the command deck of a warship, a cruiser he'd work out later, of a fleet caught in the ugly middle ground of the war, where nobody yet knew for certain who'd turned and who hadn't. He came out of the tier already falling, already reading the room, mercy and redemption clearing their holsters before his boots touched the deck, and by the time he'd landed in a low crouch with both pistols up he had, in the space of a single second, catalogued the entire tableau. 40-odd armed humans in naval uniform, a scatter of the giant transhuman warriors in blue and white, and every last weapon on the deck now pointed at him. "Well," Strife said, straightening slowly, both pistols still up but his tone easy as a man at a bar. "This is a warm welcome. You always aim everything you've got at the fella who drops in. Or am I special?" Nobody fired. That, in itself, told Strife most of what he needed to know. In a room this jumpy, the fact that 40 terrified people hadn't emptied their guns into him on reflex meant somebody was in command who thought before shooting. And in the middle of a civil war where the wrong itchy trigger finger got everyone killed, that somebody was worth talking to. He found them fast, a naval officer, mid-rank by the braid, standing very still at the center of the deck with one hand raised to hold her people's fire. Beside her, one of the blue and white giants, A space marine, an ultramarine, though Strife didn't have the word yet, had a bolter trained on Strife's skull, and the flat, unimpressed calm of a warrior who had shot stranger things than this, and would happily do it again. "Identify yourself," the officer said, steady voice, frightened underneath, but steady on top, which Strife respected. "You translated onto my command deck, out of a warp tier, with no ship, no augur signature, and 2 weapons drawn. In the present hour, that makes you one of 3 things: a daemon, a traitor's assassin, or a Xenos infiltrator. None of them leaves this deck alive, so identify yourself, and make it convincing." Strife considered his options with the professional appreciation of a man who did this for a living. He could fight, he'd win probably, though the giant with the bolter would cost him, but he'd landed here specifically to learn the shape of this war, and you didn't learn the shape of a war by shooting the first people who could explain it to you. He could lie, he was superb at lying, but the officer had that look, the look of someone who'd been lied to a great deal recently, by people she'd trusted, and would smell a fresh lie like smoke, which left the option Strife found funniest and used least, the truth, deployed as a weapon. "None of the 3, Strife said, and holstered mercy, slowly, left redemption up, because you didn't disarm all the way in a room like this, and everyone present understood the etiquette. I'm a 4th thing you don't have a word for yet. My name's Strife. I'm not from your galaxy. I've got no dog in your father and son's bloodbath. And about an hour ago, some very large talking rocks that fancy themselves the judges of creation flung me and my siblings across the void to restore the balance, in a war we'd never heard of." He let that sit. "I know how it sounds. Trust me. I argued the same point with the rocks. Didn't get me anywhere either." The officer's expression did not change, but the ultramarines did, fractionally, because the giant had been listening for the specific tells of a daemon's honeyed lie, or a traitor's rehearsed cover, and what he was getting instead was a cynical, tired, faintly amused candor that matched no infiltrator's script he knew. "The whispers," the space marine said. His voice was a low rumble, addressed to the officer without taking his aim off Strife. "Before the voxnets fouled, the astropath screaming about 4 souls. The gods hunting something scattered across the war zone. The bolter did not waver, but the giant's cold eyes narrowed with calculation. The word-bearers can't, intercepted off Sirush. 4 riders, 4 thrones, the war within the war. If the traitors are hunting 4 souls, and one of them has just fallen onto our deck, then you've got a decision to make." Strife finished for him, easy as anything, and it's a real interesting one, so let me lay it out for you plain, because I do my best thinking out loud and you'll want to hear it. He turned, taking in the whole nervous deck, playing the room the way he'd played rooms for 10,000 years. "Everything that serves the 4 hungry gods of yours is racing across this galaxy right now to grab me and my siblings. The traitors want us. The daemons want us. That Primarch preacher with the tattoos wants us bad. Which means, whatever else I am, I'm the single most valuable thing that's dropped into your lap since this war started, and you can do one of 2 dumb things with me, or 1 smart thing." "Enlighten me," the officer said, dry. But she'd lowered her hand another inch, and her people had eased off their triggers a hair, and Strife felt the room tilt his way the way it always did once he got talking. "Dumb thing number 1. You shoot me. Congratulations. You've killed the one asset the enemy wants most, purely because I dropped in rude. Dumb thing number 2. You cage me, ship me off to your Inquisition, let them spend a month deciding whether I'm heresy while the traitors kick your door in looking for me." He holstered redemption at last, a calculated gesture, disarming to make a point, and he watched them clock it. "Smart thing. You figure out that the enemy of your enemy just fell out of the sky, and you talk to him. Because here's the part the rocks got wrong and I'm only now working out for myself. They sent me here to restore the balance. But your galaxy hasn't got one, and you can't restore a thing that never was. What you've got is a straight-up war between a father and the sons who turned on him. And I'll be honest with you, ma'am, because I'm allergic to preaching. I don't much care about your emperor. Never met the man. But I've spent my whole long life in the middle of exactly this kind of fight, and I know one thing cold." He spread his hands. "In a war between the loyal and the traitors, I'll take the side that isn't run by the soul-eating gods every single time. Not because your side's good, I've read your Imperium's file in about 4 minutes and it's a nightmare. But because your side's the one that's still human. And theirs isn't, not anymore. Silence on the command deck. The kind of silence where a room is deciding whether to believe something it very much wants to believe and knows better than to. The Ultramarine spoke first. You claim you'll fight the traitors. Words are cheap in the mouth of a thing that fell out of a warp rift. The bolter came up an inch. Prove it. There is a boarding action underway 2 decks below. A word-bearer's strike element that translated in behind our shields moments before you did. Hunting, no doubt for you. 20 of them at least. My squad is holding the corridor and losing. If you are what you say, the enemy of the gods, the thing the traitors want, then go down there and fight the ones who came for you. Or stay here and be shot as the liar you probably are. Strife grinned, and it was a real grin, delighted. The grin of a man who has just been offered exactly the excuse he wanted. See? Now that's how you handle an unknown quantity. Give him a problem and see which way he shoots. He was already moving toward the deck's exit, both pistols back in his hands as if they'd never left. Point me at the stairs, big fella. Let's go find out what a word-bearer looks like from the inside. What followed, 2 decks below, was the first time this galaxy got to see what one of the Four Horsemen did in a straight fight. And it was not what the word-bearers, or their gods, had been promised. The strike element had cornered the Ultramarine squad in a cargo throat, and the traitors were chanting as they killed. The 8-pointed cant, the litanies to the pantheon, the certainty of the damned who believe their gods are watching and pleased. They had come for the 4th soul, the cynical gunman the whispers spoke of, and they had every reason to think themselves the hunters. They were faithful, they were transhuman, they were backed by the reaching favor of 4 gods who wanted the very thing walking down the stairs toward them. Strife killed the first 6 before any of them understood he was there. He did not chant, he did not pray, he did not announce himself with a war cry or a challenge, because Strife had never in his existence seen the point of telling your enemy where you were. He came down the stairwell reading angles the way he always read them, the geometry of the corridor, the sight lines, the exact ricochet path off a bulkhead that would put a round through a gap in ceramite that a straight shot couldn't reach. And mercy and redemption spoke in that flat, unhurried double tap that Strife had perfected across 10,000 years of gunfights. And word-bearers who had faced Ultramarines without flinching began, for the first time, to die confused. Because the iron law held here too, in the plainest and most brutal register yet. The word-bearers' whole power was the warp, their sorceries, their daemon summonings, the blessings of the pantheon that made their bolts burn, and their blades bite with unnatural malice. And none of it touched Strife, not because he resisted it, because there was nothing in him for it to grip. The sorcerer at the strike element's heart hurled a curse that should have boiled a man's blood in his veins, and it broke against Strife like surf against a cliff, finding no soul flaw to catch on, no fear to feed, no hollow to fill. And Strife, without even breaking stride, put a round of redemption through the sorcerer's eye on a ricochet off a coolant pipe, and the curse, that found nothing, guttered out with its caster. That's the thing about your gods, Strife said conversationally, to the dying sorcerer, to the reeling strike element, to the whole reaching pantheon he knew was watching through their eyes. They only ever taught you their kind of killing, curses and blessings and daemon tricks. And it's real impressive, I'll give you that, right up until something walks in that your gods have got no purchase on at all. He shot 2 more. Elemental rounds this time. Mercy loaded with a fire that had nothing to do with the warp, and everything to do with the horsemen firing it. And the word-bearers burned with an honest flame their blessings couldn't quench. Then it turns out all your faith bought you was a fancier way to lose a gunfight. The Ultramarines, pinned and bleeding in the cargo throat, watched a stranger who had fallen out of a warp rift 10 minutes earlier dismantle a word-bearer's strike element that had been about to overrun them, watched it done without a single prayer, a single blessing, a single appeal to any god at all, just cold geometry and impossible marksmanship, and a running commentary delivered in the tone of a man mildly bored by his own competence. And the squad's sergeant, a veteran who had believed he understood every kind of warrior this galaxy could field, revised his understanding on the spot. When the last word-bearer fell, the strike leader, who died reaching for a grenade and cursing the 4 gods who had promised him this soul would be prey, Strife stood in the cargo throat among 20 traitor dead, reloaded both pistols with the unhurried care of a man tidying up after a chore, and looked up at the astonished ultramarines with that same easy grin. "So," he said, "about that decision your officer's making upstairs. I figure I just cast a vote." He holstered Mercy and offered the sergeant a hand up out of the cover the Marines had been about to die in. "Enemy of your enemy. Fell out of the sky. Doesn't pray to the things eating your galaxy and shoots the ones that do." The grin widened. "In my experience, that's about as good an ally as a fella gets in the middle of a civil war. And believe me, I've been in a lot of civil wars." The sergeant looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Then he took it and let the horseman haul him up, and something shifted on that blood-slick deck that would matter a great deal later, when 4 riders and a fracturing Imperium had to decide what they were to one another. "You said siblings," the sergeant said as he rose. "4 of you." "4," Strife agreed, holstering the last of his easy manner along with his pistols, and for just a moment, the cynic's drawl thinned and let something older and colder show through. The thing under Strife, the thing that had watched the Council for 10,000 years and trusted it exactly as far as he could throw one of its burning faces. "Scattered across your war, alone, with every god you've got, racing to grab us. And I'll tell you the part I didn't tell your officer, Sergeant, because you just bled beside me and that buys you the truth." He looked up, past the cargo throat ceiling, past the hull, toward the churning warp where 4 hungers watched him with a covetousness, curdling fast toward frustration. "Those gods think they're hunting us. They've been hunting us since we landed, and every one of them, so far, has reached for one of us and pulled back a stump." The cold thing in his eyes glinted. "They haven't worked out yet that we're not the prey. We never were. The rocks didn't send bait into your galaxy, Sergeant." He started back toward the stairs, toward the command deck and the officer and the decision that was, he already knew, going to break his way. "They sent a verdict, and it's just now finished reading the file." The gods conferred, and the conferring alone was a thing that had not happened in 10,000 years. Understand what that meant. The 4 ruinous powers did not cooperate. Could not by their deepest nature. Khorne's honest slaughter despising Tzeentch's endless scheming. Nurgle's warm stagnation an affront to Slaanesh's ravenous refinement. Each god's entire being defined in opposition to the other 3. Their eternal war was as fundamental to the warp as the tides to an ocean. In all the long history of chaos, the 4 had aligned only once or twice, and only ever for a heartbeat, and only ever to devour something too vast for any one of them to swallow alone. Now they aligned again, and the thing that forced it was that each of them had reached, and each of them had failed, and the failure was identical. Khorne had reached for war, on the Black Sand world, expecting the easiest claiming of the 4, a warrior, a wrath, a soul that lived by the blade. The Blood God had offered the Red Rider the only thing it had ever offered anyone: endless slaughter, a skull throne, the purity of a rage with no thought behind it. And War, who fought because judgment sometimes required it, and never because he hungered to, had looked at the offer of a wrath without purpose, and been not tempted but insulted, and had told the Skull Throne, in as many words, that killing without a verdict behind it was not strength but appetite, and appetite was a small and stupid thing to build a god out of. Khorne, who could not comprehend a warrior who did not want to kill for its own sake, had recoiled from a soul that fought and did not hunger, and did not understand what it had touched. Nurgle had reached for death and found a reaper who called its garden a cage. Slaanesh had reached for fury and been told, with pity, that everything was not enough. Tzeentch had reached for Strife, the schemer for the schemer, the architect of fate certain it had found its natural instrument, and discovered a mind that read every angle of every plan it was offered and simply declined. Not out of virtue, but out of a cynicism so total it saw through the god's manipulations to the appetite underneath, and found the whole thing tediously transparent. You could not weave a soul into your scheme when that soul had spent 10,000 years learning to spot exactly the kind of open door you were holding. 4 gods, 4 reaches, 4 stumps. And so they conferred, in the deep warp, in a council that was less a meeting than 4 vast appetites circling one intolerable fact. And the fact was this: they had been seen. Not resisted, not fought, seen, weighed, understood, and found wanting, by four souls who had looked into the four hungers that ruled this galaxy, and pronounced them, with varying degrees of contempt and pity, small, insufficient, a quartet of appetites masquerading as gods, and nothing in creation enrages a god like being condescended to by the thing it meant to eat. There was, in the conferring, a voice for each hunger, and the voices did not agree on what to do, because even united in fury the four could not truly be united, but they agreed on the shape of the problem, and the shape of the problem was, they are trying to reach one another. For the four riders had begun, across the burning galaxy, to move toward reunion. War had found a war fleet, and a name for the massacre world behind him, and set his course by the astropathic screaming toward the largest concentration of the war, reasoning correctly that his siblings would be drawn to the same fires. Death had left the plague world and walked the paths between worlds that only death could walk, following a pull older than the warp, the bond of the four, which no distance had ever fully severed. Fury had come out of the ruined gallery into open void, and felt her brothers like heat through a wall, and turned toward them. And Strife, aboard an ultramarine cruiser that had, after the cargo throat, after the command deck, after a conversation the officer would spend the rest of her life not quite believing, thrown its lot in with him, was even now steering that ship toward the same convergence. Four souls, scattered and hunted, closing on one another across a galaxy at war, and every god in that galaxy understood, in the deep cold place beneath its rage, the same thing. The four apart were four insults. The four together would be something else. Something that did not merely refuse the gods but might, conceivably, judge them, and act on the judgment. Then they must not converge, said the voice of scheming, and the other three, for once, did not argue. What the gods did next was the cleverest and cruelest thing done in the whole of that hidden war, and it was done not with daemons or armies, but with the one weapon the four hungers had always wielded best, the war that was already burning. They did not send monsters to stop the riders. Monsters had failed. Instead, they reached into the heresy itself, into the vast, self-immolating machinery of a galaxy already dedicated to fratricide, and they aimed it. A whisper to a word-bearer's fleetmaster here, a vision granted to a Night Lord's raid leader there, a warp storm nudged into the convergence point, a loyalist astropath's message subtly corrupted so that the four riders' movements were laid bare to every servant of the pantheon in the sector. The gods did not need to build a trap. They had a galaxy-sized war lying ready to hand, and all they had to do was point it at the 4 points of convergence and let the machinery of the heresy do the killing for them. And so, as the four riders closed on one another, on a contested void station in the war's ragged middle ground, a place both sides wanted and neither yet held, chosen by the riders' shared instinct as the point their converging paths would meet, the whole apparatus of the traitor cause turned, quietly and enormously, to meet them there. Lorgar's word-bearers, who wanted the prize most, a Night Lord's terror fleet, promised the pleasure of breaking souls that had never known fear. Daemon things poured through a warp storm the gods had seeded across the station's approaches. And, drawn by the sheer gravity of the thing the gods were building, other predators of the war besides, because in the heresy, blood drew blood, and a battle this size drew every killer in reach. The four riders arrived at the void station within hours of one another, and reunited at last on its shattered central concourse. And it was a thing to see, that reunion, four souls of an ended world, finding one another across the vastness of a galaxy that had tried and failed to swallow each of them alone. War came through a breached docking throat with Chaos Eater bloodied from cutting his way to the meeting. Death was simply there, as death was, having walked the paths between. Fury dropped from a shattered gantry in a line of flame. Strife strolled in off a captured shuttle with an ultramarine strike force at his back, and a grin that said he'd talked at least 3 impossible things into happening on the way. For a moment, just a moment, the four stood together on the ruined concourse, reunited, whole, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse standing as one, in a galaxy that had never seen their like, and the sheer rightness of it rang through the warp like a struck bell. And then every god in the galaxy sprang the trap it had built out of the war itself, and the void station became the single most violent point in the entire Horus Heresy for the space of 1 terrible hour. It came from every direction at once, The word-bearers hit the station's spine, chanting, a whole grand company of the faithful pouring in to claim the prize for Lorgar and the Pantheon. The Night Lords came through the dark of the outer decks, killing the lights before they killed the living. The Masters of Terror gliding in to break souls they'd been promised would scream. The warp storm birthed daemons onto the concourse in a tide of brass and rot and perfume and change. The children of all four hungers, flung at the riders together in the closest thing to cooperation the four gods had managed in 10 millennia. Titans of the war, tricked or lured or simply drawn to the slaughter, walked the station's outer hull. It was not a battle. It was an avalanche. The entire weight of the traitor cause and its gods dropped onto four souls in a single coordinated hour, meant to bury them before they could become what the gods feared they'd become. What the gods had not accounted for, what the gods, in their vast ancient appetite, could not account for, because it was outside everything they understood, was what the four riders were when they stood together. Apart, each had been formidable. Each had, alone, humbled a god's champion and walked out untouched. But the Four Horsemen had not been made to fight alone. They had been forged as a single instrument, four aspects of one function, and when they fought as one, they were not 4 times as dangerous. They were something categorically different. The reason the Charred Council had spared exactly these four out of an entire unmade race. The reason a galaxy's worth of gods had been afraid. War became the anchor, the wall, the point the avalanche broke against. Chaos Eater carving through daemon and traitor alike. The Red Rider planting himself at the concourse's heart and simply not moving, no matter what the four hungers threw at him. An immovable verdict in crimson iron. Death moved through the enemy like the thing he was, and where he moved the daemons ended. Not banished, not merely killed, but reaped. Sent through the door and not permitted back. The Pale Rider unmaking the warp's children with an authority over ending that no daemon had ever faced, and none survived. Fury was the fire on the flanks, scorn cracking through the Night Lord's terror tactics. For how do you terrorize a soul that has already conquered its own worst fear? The Huntress turning the Masters of Dread into simply more prey. And Strife was everywhere and nowhere, reading the whole impossible battle as a single geometry, his pistols speaking in that flat double tap, killing sorcerers before their curses formed, and warlords before their orders landed, and, because he was Strife, talking the entire time, coordinating the ultramarine survivors, turning a massacre into a defense, threading the four riders' individual ferocities into a single unbreakable line. And the gods, watching through 10,000 eyes as their avalanche broke against four souls standing together, felt their fury curdle at last, fully and finally, into the thing they had been circling since the first failed reach. Fear. Because the trap had been perfect. The trap had been the entire weight of the heresy itself, aimed with a god's precision at four scattered souls. And the four souls had stood in it, had let the whole avalanche come, and held, and begun, methodically, to turn it back. Not winning easily, the hour cost them, and the ultramarines who'd thrown in with Strife died in it, and even the riders were pressed as they had not been pressed since the fall of their own kind, but holding, unbroken, together. And every god watching understood the same intolerable arithmetic. We sent everything, and it was not enough, and now they are together, and they have seen us, and they are still deciding what to do about it. It was Lorgar, at the far end of the concourse, Lorgar Aurelian, who had come in person to claim his prize, who had wanted to preach the four into the Pantheon, and now watched his grand company die around him, who first spoke aloud the thing the gods were feeling. They were never the prize, the Golden Primarch said, and his voice was hollow with a prophet's dawning horror. We reached for four gods to fatten the Pantheon, and what we reached for was four judges, and we have just shown them, with our own hand, the whole of what we are. He stared down the ruined concourse at the four riders standing in the wreck of the gods' perfect trap, and Lorgar Aurelian, who had faith enough to swallow any doubt, felt his faith fail to swallow this one. We didn't stop them converging. We introduced ourselves. We showed the executioners of an ended world exactly what this galaxy's gods will do to claim a soul. His golden hands fell to his sides, and now they've seen the verdict, and they're going to deliver it. On the concourse, as the last of the avalanche broke and the demons guttered and the surviving traitors pulled back into the dark, The four riders stood together in the wreckage, unclaimed and unbroken, and finally, fully aware of what they had landed in the middle of. Death spoke, because the weight of the judgment fell to him as it always did. He looked at the wreckage, and the reaped demons, and the dead ultramarines who had died as allies, and the golden Primarch retreating down the far concourse, and past all of it, up, into the warp where four hungers watched their broken trap, and felt fear for the first time in 10,000 years. "They have shown us what they are," Death said quietly. "Every one of them reached for us, and we felt the whole of it. The wrath with no purpose, the garden that is a cage, the perfection that is a prison, the scheme with only appetite beneath it. And now they have thrown a galaxy's war at us, to keep us from standing together, and failed, and shown us that too." The mask tilted toward the churning dark. "We came to judge a galaxy with no balance. I have seen enough of it now to judge." He drew both harvesters, and around him, his brothers and sister drew their own weapons, and the four horsemen stood as one, in the ruin the gods had made. But there is one thing left to weigh, before the verdict. One power in this galaxy we have not yet stood before, the corpse god on his golden throne, the father all this fratricide is about. He looked at the other three, and they at him, and the decision passed between the four without a word, as decisions always had. "Before we judge this galaxy," Death said, "we will judge the thing at the heart of it. We will go to the golden throne, and stand before the deathless Father, and weigh him, the one being here who forbade his people their gods, and built an empire of 1,000,000 worlds on that refusal, and is now watching it burn." The pale rider turned toward the deep of the galaxy, toward a single distant thread of gold that streamed from one world, one throne, one will. And then, and only then, will the four of us decide what this galaxy deserves. And far away, on the throne world, at the heart of the fraying gold, something that had not been surprised in a very long time, felt four souls turn their judgment toward him, and the master of mankind, entombed in agony on the golden throne, opened his attention fully, for the first time, to the four riders he had felt fall into his galaxy, and had been, in the vast silent calculus of his war, waiting for. They came to Terra the way judgment comes, unannounced, unstoppable, and later than the guilty would have liked. No fleet carried them. Death walked the paths between worlds, and the other three walked them with him, the four riders moving through the between places that no astropath charted and no warp storm touched, and they came out of that between place standing on the surface of the throne world itself, inside the walls, past the void shields and the orbital guns, and the numberless legions that would soon ring this world in the last defense of the Imperium. They stood in the shadow of the Imperial Palace, a structure so vast it had its own weather, mountain ranges of Gothic stone and gold rising into a sky perpetually hazed with the incense of 10,000 shrines. And even war, who had walked the halls of heaven and hell, went quiet at the scale of the thing mankind had built to house its refusal to kneel. They were met, of course. You did not translate onto the surface of the throne world unremarked. The Legio Custodes came for them, the Emperor's own, the 10,000, gold-armored demigods who had never in 10,000 years failed to destroy a threat to their master, and they came not as guards but as executioners, guardian spears leveled, moving with a lethal certainty that made the Astartes look like children playing at war. The Custodes were, of everything the riders had faced in this galaxy, the closest to their own tier. Warriors individually forged, each a masterwork, each worth 100 space marines, utterly without fear, and utterly without the flaw of faith, for the Custodes did not worship the Emperor. They knew him. They had stood beside him for 10,000 years, and they did not intend to let four unknown souls walk one step closer to the golden throne. It could have been a slaughter, on either side. It was Death who stopped it, Death, who raised no weapon, and simply stood, and let the 10,000 feel what he was. And the Custodes, who could not be tricked, and could not be tempted, and could not be made to fear, felt the pale rider's nature, the way the truly perceptive always did, not as a threat, but as an inevitability. Here was the ending itself, walked onto their master's world on two legs, and the 10,000 were wise enough, old enough, close enough to a being who had stared into every abyss, to understand that you do not raise your spear against the door. You do not fight death. You only meet him with dignity when he comes. And then the Emperor spoke, and every custodian lowered his spear at once. He did not speak aloud. The master of mankind had not drawn breath in 10,000 years. His ruined body was fused to the golden throne deep in the palace's heart, kept alive by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. His flesh, long since surrendered to his function. But his will reached out across the palace and touched the four riders directly, mind to mind. And it was a thing none of them, not even Death, who had spoken with the judges of creation, had quite been prepared for. Because the Emperor of mankind was, whatever else he was, one of the mightiest psychic beings in the material universe. And to be addressed by him directly was to feel the sheer pressure of a mind that had been thinking, without pause, for 10,000 years, about a single all-consuming problem. Come, the Emperor said, to the four of them, into the deep of their minds. You have come to weigh me. I have been waiting. Come then, and weigh. And the custodies parted, and the four riders walked through the endless halls of the palace to the heart of it, to the vast cathedral vault that housed the golden throne, and stood at last before the master of mankind. He was a horror. There was no gentler word. The being who had lifted humanity out of the long night, who had conquered a galaxy and forbidden it its gods, who was worshipped by 1,000,000 worlds as the God Emperor, was a withered, eyeless, fleshless thing, fused to a machine, a corpse that would not die, held in agony past all mercy by the very refusal to end that death had condemned in Mortarion. And the four riders looked upon him, and each of them understood something different, and the understanding was the beginning of the verdict. Death saw a being kept past his ending, and felt the old disgust stir, and then saw the difference, the crucial difference, between this and the plague world. Mortarion had chosen the cage out of fear. This being had chosen it out of duty. The Emperor was not held on his throne by a god's imprisoning love. He was held there by the fact that if he let go, if he allowed himself the ending his ruined body had begged for, across 10,000 years of agony, the light that guided his entire species through the warp would go out, and the numberless billions who depended on it would be lost. He was not clinging to life. He was refusing to be relieved of a burden, at a cost of continuous agony beyond mortal comprehension, because there was no one else who could carry it. You are in pain, Death said, and it was not an accusation now. Every hour, every one of the 10,000 years, and you do not stop, because if you stop, they die. The mask tilted. That is not the Plague Lord's cowardice. That is the opposite of it. You have made yourself the door that will not open, so that your people do not have to walk through theirs before their time. Yes, the Emperor said. There was no self-pity in it. There was, in fact, almost nothing left in him but the function. A will, worn down to a single unwavering purpose across 100 centuries of torment. I forbade them their gods because I saw what the gods are. You have seen it too now. You reached your hands into the warp and pulled back stumps. And you know, the four hungers are not gods. They are appetites that learn to feed on worship, and every soul that believes in them makes them stronger. So I built an empire that would believe in nothing, that would deny the warp its worship. And I meant, in time, to lead my species into an age of reason where the gods would starve. A pause, and in the pause was the whole tragedy of him. I failed. My own sun turned. My empire is burning. And the thing I built to starve the gods has become, in my absence, a theocracy that worships me, the one outcome I forbade above all others. I am a corpse god, worshipped by an empire founded on the refusal to worship. That is my judgment on myself. Now render yours. And here it was, the core of it. The dilemma the council had flung four riders across a galaxy to face, distilled to a single confrontation in a cathedral of gold. It was War who spoke the hard part, because War had walked out of a crater of the loyal dead, with a verdict forming, and had carried it every step since. I stood in the ruin your war made, War said. 50,000 of your loyal sons, murdered by their brothers, and one of them dying in my arms, cursing the dark, keeping faith with you, and it changed nothing. He died loyal to a father who had already been outmaneuvered by gods, and I have carried that all the way to your throne. wanting to know. Was he a fool? Was his faith wasted? Did you deserve it? The Red Rider's hand rested on Chase Eater. Because your Imperium is a horror, Emperor. I have read it, world by world, on the way here. It burns worlds. It sacrifices billions. It murders its own psychers by the thousand to keep you breathing. It is xenophobic and superstitious and cruel beyond the reckoning of anything I've judged. By every measure I have ever used, it deserves to fall. It does, the Emperor agreed, and that agreement landed harder than any defense could have. By every measure of justice, my Imperium deserves to fall. I do not dispute it. I built something monstrous. I know it. Then why, Fury demanded, should we not let it? Why should the four of us not stand aside, or worse, and let this whole rotten empire burn down to the ground it was built on? Give me one reason that isn't the horror of the alternative. And the Emperor gave her the reason that was the horror of the alternative, and it was the trap at the center of the entire galaxy. Because I am the only thing standing between my monstrous empire and the Four Hungers, the Emperor said, and the Four Hungers are worse. That is the whole of it. That is the verdict this galaxy forces on anyone honest enough to render it. My Imperium is a horror, and if it falls, what replaces it is not freedom, not reason, not some kinder order. What replaces it is chaos, the garden that is a cage, the perfection that is a prison, the wrath with no purpose, the scheme with only appetite beneath it. You have stood before all four. You know what they offer. My monstrous empire is the only thing in this galaxy with the scale and the will to hold them back, and I am the only thing holding my monstrous empire together. That is not a defense. It is a damnation. I am asking you to weigh a horror against a greater horror, and there is no clean answer, and I have had 10,000 years to look for one, and there is not one. There is only the lesser ruin. Silence in the Cathedral of Gold. The four riders stood before the corpse god, and the weight of it settled on them, because this was the thing the Charred Council had never had to face. The council weighed order against ruin on a clean scale, in a reality with a balance. Here there was no clean scale. Here there was only a monstrous empire against monstrous gods, a horror against a greater horror, and a dying father on a golden throne who agreed his empire deserved to fall and kept it standing anyway, because the alternative was worse. It was Strife, Strife the cynic, who trusted nothing and read every angle, who found the thing underneath, the thing that turned the verdict. You're not asking us to save your empire, Strife said slowly, and for once there was no drawl in it. You know we won't. You know we can't. Four riders can't hold a galaxy that's already falling, and you're too old and too honest to pretend otherwise. That's not what you called us here for. He looked at the ruined thing on the throne with the flat, clear sight that had seen through four gods. You called us here because we're the only things in your whole galaxy that reached into the warp and came back uneaten. The gods couldn't take us, couldn't tempt us, couldn't corrupt us, couldn't kill us. We're the one kind of soul the Four Hungers have got no purchase on at all. His eyes narrowed. You don't want us to save the Imperium. You want us to do the one thing you never could. You want us to hurt the gods. And the Emperor of mankind, corpse and horror and father and the loneliest being in the galaxy, said the truest thing he had said in 10,000 years. Yes, I cannot reach them, the Emperor said, and now something moved in the vast worn will, something that in a lesser being would have been desperation. I have fought the Four Hungers for my entire existence, and I cannot destroy them, because I am of this galaxy, and everything of this galaxy only feeds them. My war feeds Khorne. My empire's despair feeds Nurgle. Its schemes feed Tzeentch. Its excess feeds Slaanesh. I cannot strike the gods without making them stronger. But you are not of this galaxy. You are not woven into the thing they feed on. You reached into them, and they could not grip you. You are the one weapon in all of creation that could be turned against the Four Hungers without fattening them in the turning. The eyeless ruin of his face, fixed on the four riders. I am not asking you to save my empire. I know what it is. I am asking you to weigh the gods that are eating my galaxy, and if your verdict on them is what I believe it will be, to do to them what only you four can do. Not save the Imperium. Wound the things that made this war. Give my species, monstrous and doomed as it is, one thing the gods never expected to face. a judgment they cannot eat. The four riders stood in the cathedral of gold before the dying father, and the verdict, the real verdict, the one the council had flung them across a galaxy to render, came clear at last. They would not save the Imperium. It was a horror, and it deserved to fall, and it would fall, in time, whatever four riders did. That much justice was plain. But the gods, the four hungers that had made this war, that had turned a father's finest sons against him, that had reached for four souls and been unable to take them, and thrown a galaxy's slaughter at them in spite. The gods were a different verdict entirely. The gods were the imbalance the council had felt tear the web. The gods were the thing that fed on the fratricide and grew fat, and would, if unchecked, do to other galaxies what they had done to this one. And the gods were the one thing in all of creation that four souls of an ended world could strike without feeding. Death spoke the verdict, because it fell to him. "We came to judge this galaxy," Death said, into the vast gold silence, to the corpse god and the watching custodes, and the four hungers he knew were listening through every shadow in the warp. "And here is the judgment. The Empire is a horror, and it will fall, and we will not save it. That is not ours to save, and it does not deserve saving, and you know it better than we do." He drew both harvesters, and around him, war and fury and strife drew their own weapons, and the four riders stood as one before the golden throne. But the gods that made this war, the four appetites that reached for us and could not take us, and threw a galaxy's dead at us for the insult of being uneatable, they are the verdict. They are the imbalance we were sent to answer, and they are the one thing in this whole burning galaxy that we can strike, and that they cannot feed on in the striking. The mask lifted toward the churning dark. "You have fought them alone for 10,000 years, Father, and could not reach them. We are not alone, and we are not of this galaxy, and we have already made each of them pull back a stump." Death's voice was quiet and certain, and it rang through the cathedral like the closing of a door. "So we will do the thing you never could. We will make the gods afraid, and then we will decide, together, whether four riders can do more than frighten them, whether a galaxy with no balance can be given, at the point of four blades, one honest verdict its gods cannot swallow." And in the deep of the warp, the four hungers, who had reached for four souls and pulled back stumps, who had thrown a war at them and failed, who had just heard four riders stand before the corpse god and name them the verdict, felt, all four at once, for the first time in 10,000 years, the thing they had spent an eternity making mortals feel. They felt the door open. They felt the Reaper turn toward them, and the gods of the Warhammer galaxy, the near-omnipotent apex of one of the darkest settings in all fiction, did the one thing no one in 10,000 years had ever seen them do. They braced. The gods, being cornered, did what cornered things always do. They stopped scheming, and they reached for the biggest weapon in the house. His name was Angron, and he was the Red Angel, and he was the closest thing the four hungers had to a fist that could hit a horseman. Understand what Khorne sent. The other gods had schemes still. Tzeentch weaving contingencies, Slaanesh nursing its wounded appetite, Nurgle brooding in its garden. But the blood god had never had a scheme in its existence, and it did not start now. Khorne had one answer to every problem, and the answer was slaughter, and its finest instrument of slaughter in that entire age of the galaxy was the Primarch it had broken and remade into a living engine of rage. Angron, the World Eater. Angron, whose skull had been carved open and packed with the cortical implants called the Butcher's Nails, so that every thought that was not violence brought him agony, and only killing brought relief. Angron, who had been a slave and a gladiator and a rebel, whose whole army of brothers in chains the Emperor had abandoned to die so that Angron alone could be taken. A betrayal that had hollowed the Primarch into a thing that hated the entire galaxy and every being in it, his own father most of all. Khorne poured its full favor into the Red Angel and aimed him at the four riders, and it was, in its way, the most honest thing any god did in the whole hidden war. No trap, no lure, no temptation, just the biggest, angriest weapon the blood god had, thrown at the four souls it could not eat, with a single command: kill them. They met him on a dead world the war had already gutted, a nameless rock the riders had come to because Angron was there, and the confrontation could not be dodged, and because death judged it better to face the blood god's fist on empty ground than let it fall on the living. And when the Red Angel came down onto that dead world, wreathed in the raw red light of Khorne's favor, chained axes howling, a whole grand company of world eaters roaring in his wake, even the four riders felt the weight of what the blood god had sent. Because Angron was not Fulgrim, trapped and pitiable in his flawless cage. Angron was not Mortarion, tired and afraid behind his god's warm lie. Angron was rage made into a Primarch, a demigod general, one of the mightiest warriors this galaxy had ever forged, and behind him the full might of Khorne, the honest apex slaughter that was the setting ceiling of raw martial force. He hit their line like a world falling, and for the first time since they had come to this galaxy, the four riders were not toying with a god's champion. They were fighting for their existence. The Iron Law held, it always held, but here, at last, the galaxy answered their real power with something that could genuinely meet it. Khorne's slaughter magic could not corrupt a horseman, and could not tempt one. But the blood god had never needed magic to be dangerous. Its favor made Angron faster, stronger, harder to put down, poured raw murder into a Primarch who was already among the deadliest beings alive. And the butcher's nails meant there was no reasoning with him, no judging him, no truth to speak that would make him pause, because Angron was a being for whom every second not spent killing was physical agony, and the four riders' whole method, to judge, to weigh, to speak the truth that stayed a hand, shattered against a mind that could not hear it. So they stopped trying to judge him, and fought him instead, and the fight was the most violent thing this galaxy had seen since the war began. War met Angron blade to blade, because that was war's function, and because Chaos Eater was the one weapon among the four built to trade blows with a thing this large. And it was, briefly, terribly, an even match. The Red Angels chained axes against the Black Greatsword, two forces of martial apocalypse hammering at each other on a dead world under a dead sky, each blow cratering the ground, each parry ringing across the emptiness like the tolling of a broken bell. Angron fought with the boundless fury of Khorne's favor and 10,000 years of hate. War fought with the disciplined, purposeful wrath that had made the blood god recoil from him in the first place. Every stroke a judgment, no motion wasted, the immovable red verdict meeting the unstoppable red rage. And war, alone, could not have won. That was the truth of it, and it was the point. Angron was too much. A Primarch at the full height of a god's favor was a thing built to kill anything this galaxy could field, and one horseman, however mighty, was pressed to his limit and past it. Chaos Eater bit deep into the Red Angel's flank, and the wound closed with Khorne's fire. War took a chained axe across the chest, and his red iron split, and he staggered. Alone, War would have fallen. But War was not alone. That was the whole lesson the gods had failed to learn, and were about to learn at the point of four blades. Death came in from the Red Angel's blind side, and where War traded blows, Death did the thing only Death could do. He did not try to overpower Angron, he tried to end him, both harvesters seeking not the armor or the flesh, but the thread of the life itself. The Reaper's authority over ending brought to bear on a Primarch for the first time, and Angron felt it, felt the door swing toward him, felt the one thing the butcher's nails could not rage away, the cold certainty of an ending that did not care how strong he was. And for the first time in the fight, the Red Angel's boundless fury met something it could not simply outslaughter, and had to turn, and defend, and fear. And in the instant Angron turned to face the door, fury took his legs. Scorn wrapped the Red Angel's knee in a line of pure force, and fury pulled, and even a Primarch's balance broke, and Angron went down to one knee on the dead ground, and Strife, who had been reading the whole impossible fight as a single geometry since it began, put 4 elemental rounds through the exact gap in the World Eater's armor that Fury's pull had opened, fire that had nothing to do with the warp burning into the Red Angel's side where Khorne's favor could not quench it. That was the shape of it. That was what the four riders were together, and what no god had understood until this dead world. Not 4 warriors fighting side by side, but a single instrument with 4 functions, each covering the other's gaps, War the anchor, and Death the ending, and Fury the leverage, and Strife the eyes, so that a Primarch, who could have killed any one of them alone, found himself facing all 4 as one thing, and no matter which way he turned, the other 3 were already in the gaps. And still it was not easy. Angron was a Primarch, and Khorne's favor was vast, and the World Eater's grand company had to be broken by the same four hands, and the fight ground on across the dead world for the better part of an hour, and it cost. Fury took a wound that would have killed a lesser thing. War's red iron ran with his own blood. Even death was pressed as he had not been since the fall of the Nephilim. The gods had sent their honest fist, and the fist was mighty enough that 4 horsemen of the apocalypse had to spend everything they had to hold it. But they held it, and then, together, they broke it. The end came when Angron, bleeding from a dozen wounds that Khorne's fire could no longer close fast enough, his grand company slaughtered around him, faced on all four sides by an instrument he could not outrage, gathered the whole of the blood god's favor into one final berserk charge, the Red Angel throwing his entire ruined, magnificent existence at the four riders, in the only answer the butcher's nails had ever let him give. It was glorious, in the terrible way of the setting. It was a Primarch dying the only way Khorne had left him able to die. Charging, screaming, axes howling. A slave's rage turned into a god's weapon, making its last and greatest stroke. And the four riders met the charge as one. War took the axes, planted himself in the Red Angel's path and caught both chained blades on Chaositor in a parry that drove him back a full stride and cracked the dead ground beneath his heels. The immovable verdict holding against the unstoppable rage for one impossible heartbeat. Fury's whip took Angron's arm at the height of the stroke, fouling the killing blow. Strife's fire found the gaps War's parry had opened, and death stepped inside the whole of it, past the axes and the fury and the god's last favor, and laid both harvesters against the thread of the Red Angel's life, and did not reap it. Stopped, both blades at the ending. The door swung fully open, Angron's existence a breath from the reaper's harvest, and death held there, and did not cut. Because even here, even against the blood god's honest fist, the horsemen were not butchers, and death did not reap what he had not finished judging. And in that frozen instant, the Red Angel spent and broken, and one stroke from ending, the four riders' full instrument closed around him, the door wide open. Death looked into the ruined thing Khorne had made of a slave, and saw, past the butcher's nails, and the god's favor, and 10,000 years of engineered rage, the thing underneath. A gladiator who had loved his brothers in chains, and been the only one taken, and been remade into a weapon precisely so that he could never grieve them, because the nails turned every thought that was not killing into agony. "You were not always this," Death said quietly, both harvesters at the Red Angel's throat, the whole roaring fury stilled by the nearness of the door. "Someone made you into a fist, and put you in a god's hand. You loved something, once, before they carved it out of your skull. I can see the place where it was." The mask tilted. "I could end you now. It would be a mercy, the only rest the nails have ever let you have, and some tired part of you, under all the rage, would be glad of it. I have seen that gladness before, in another of your father's sons." Angron, spent and pinned and a breath from the Reaper's blade, snarled through his agony the only answer the nails had left him. "Then do it, Reaper. Kill me. That's all. That's all there's ever been. Killing and being killed. Do it and let me stop." And Death made the choice that separated the horsemen from everything in that galaxy. The choice he had made on the Plague World and Fury had made in the gallery. The choice that was the whole difference between a judge and an executioner. He lifted the blades. "No," Death said, "not as a kindness to a god that would only make another fist to replace you, and not as a punishment, because you have been punished enough for crimes that were done to you, not by you." He stepped back, and the door swung shut, and the Red Angel knelt spent and unreaped on the dead ground, staring at the Reaper who had held his ending in both hands and given it back. "Your death would feed Khorne. Everything about you was built to feed Khorne. So I will not give the blood god your death. I will give it something it has never once received from anything it made a weapon of." Death turned away from the kneeling Primarch, toward the churning warp where the blood god watched its honest fist broken and spared in a single stroke. "I will give it nothing, no slaughter, no skull. No death to fatten the throne, just its greatest weapon, broken and returned, and the knowledge that the four souls it sent Angron to kill could have reaped him and chose not to, because his death was worth more to your god than to us, and we do not give the gods what they hunger for." And the four riders left the Red Angel kneeling alive on the dead world, the single most valuable death in the blood god's reach, ungiven, and turned together toward the deep of the warp, toward the four hungers that had thrown their finest fist, and had it broken, and handed back empty. It was War who spoke the thing they had all understood in the breaking of Angron, the thing that turned the whole hidden war at last. They sent us their best, War said, looking at his own blood on his red iron, at the wounds Four Horsemen had taken to break one Primarch and his company. And it cost us. Don't mistake it, it cost us. This galaxy's top tier is real, and its gods are the ceiling of everything terrible, and we are not gods, and we should not pretend to be. He looked at his siblings, battered and bleeding and standing. But they threw everything Khorne had at us, and we are still standing, and their weapon is kneeling behind us alive, unreaped, given back empty, because we finally understand the one thing the gods never will. He turned toward the warp, toward the four watching hungers, and Chase Eater rose in his fist. They feed on what they take. Death, slaughter, despair, corruption. Everything they reach for makes them fatter. And we are the one thing in creation that can face them and refuse to feed them, not by beating them, by denying them the harvest. Every death we don't give, every soul we don't let them corrupt, every fist they throw that we break and hand back empty. His voice rang across the dead world. That's the verdict, siblings. Not to save this galaxy. It can't be saved, and it doesn't deserve saving, but to starve its gods, to be the one thing in all of creation that walks through the warp and gives it nothing, to make the four hungers afraid, for the first time in 10,000 years, of a soul they cannot eat. And in the deep of the warp, the four ruinous powers, near omnipotent, apex, the ceiling of one of the darkest settings ever imagined, looked upon four riders standing bloodied and unbroken over the blood god's spared and broken fist, and understood, all four at once, the shape of the verdict that had been rendered against them. They could not eat these souls. They could not corrupt them, tempt them, or take them. They had thrown their finest weapon and had it handed back empty, denied even the death. And these four intended to walk the galaxy giving the gods nothing. No worship, no slaughter, no despair, no corruption. A moving verdict of starvation loose in the one place the gods had always fed freely. For the first time since before the Eldari fell, the four hungers of the Warhammer galaxy knew fear. And the fear was this: they had finally met something that could not be fed to them, and it had decided to make them go hungry. They gathered one last time on the surface of the throne world, in the shadow of the palace, to render the verdict whole, and to decide what four riders do when they have judged a galaxy and found it guilty of nothing so much as being trapped. The war had not stopped for them. It never would. Even as the four stood in the palace's endless shadow, the heresy ground on across the galaxy, Horus driving toward Terra, the loyal and the traitor legions bleeding each other white, worlds dying by the score. Four riders could not halt that. They had never been able to. A galaxy-spanning civil war was beyond the power of even the Four Horsemen to stop, and they had known it since war climbed out of the crater of the loyal dead. The heresy would run its course. The corpse god would break his own son, and be broken in the doing. The Imperium would survive as a horror and decay across 10,000 years into the greater horror it was always going to become. None of that was theirs to change. That was the galaxy's own long tragedy, and it would play out whether or not four souls of an ended world stood witness to it. But the gods were a different verdict, and the verdict on the gods was the one thing four riders could deliver. "We have waited," Death said, and the other three stood with him, battered from the breaking of Angron, whole in the way that mattered. All of it, the Empire, the Father, the War, the Four Hungers. And here is the judgment, entire. He looked up, past the palace's incense-hazed sky, into the warp where four gods now watched the riders with something they had not felt in an age. The Imperium is a horror, and we will not save it, because it cannot be saved and does not deserve to be. The Father on the throne is the only thing holding a greater horror at bay, at a cost of agony beyond reckoning, and we will not relieve him of that burden, because there is no one else to carry it, and he knows it better than we do. The war will run its course, and we will not stop it, because it is beyond even us. and because a galaxy must be allowed to answer for its own choices. The Pale Rider's voice hardened, and the warp itself seemed to lean in to hear the rest. But the gods, Death said, the four hungers that made this war, that turned a father's sons against him, that reached for 4 souls and could not take them, and threw a galaxy's slaughter at us for the insult, they are guilty. They are the imbalance the council felt tear the web. They are the thing that fattens on fratricide and would unchecked do to other galaxies what they have done to this one. And they are the one thing in all of creation that 4 souls from outside this galaxy can strike without feeding in the striking. He drew both harvesters, and war raised Chaos Eater, and fury uncoiled scorn, and Strife's pistols cleared their holsters. That is the sentence, not to save the galaxy, to starve its gods. And then Strife the cynic, who trusted nothing and read every angle, said the thing that turned even that verdict, the thing that was the last and hardest weighing of all. And here's where I say the part none of you want to say, Strife said, holstering his pistols, and the drawl was gone, and what was left was the cold, clear sight that had seen through 4 gods and 1 dying father. We can't stay. The other 3 looked at him. We can't, Strife said. Think it through. I have. I've been thinking about nothing else since the Red Angel knelt. We break the gods' fists. We deny them the harvest. We starve them, soul by soul, death by death withheld. And every day we do it, we get more woven into this galaxy's war. And the moment we're woven in, the moment the loyalists start praying to the 4 riders who fight the gods, the moment the Imperium builds a shrine to us, the moment a single soul in this galaxy worships what we are, he let it land. Then we become exactly what the corpse god warned us about. Worship feeds the warp. It doesn't matter what you worship. Worship 4 souls who fight the gods, and you've just made 4 new gods, and the warp eats them same as all the rest. The Father told us. He built an empire to worship nothing, and it made a corpse god of him anyway. We stay in this galaxy long enough to matter, and it makes gods of us. And then the Charred Council was right after all. It did throw 4 coins into a furnace, and the furnace melted them into 4 more of exactly the thing they were sent to judge. The silence after that was the longest of the whole war. Because Strife was right, and all 4 of them knew it, and it was the cruelest verdict in a galaxy full of cruel ones. The 4 riders could hurt the gods. They had proven it. They could walk the warp giving it nothing, a moving starvation loose in the gods' own larder. But they could not stay, because the longer they stayed, the more this galaxy would make of them, and a galaxy that made gods out of everything would, in the end, make gods out of them, and feed them to the very hungers they had come to starve. Their victory and their staying were the same act, and the act would poison itself. The only way to remain a verdict was to deliver it and leave. Then we do it in 1 stroke, Death said, understanding, as he always understood first. Not a long war, not a crusade the galaxy can build shrines around. 1 stroke, the hardest blow 4 souls can land on 4 gods, and then the council seam, back the way we came, before this galaxy can make us into anything it worships. And that is what the Four Horsemen did, in the last hour of their time in the Warhammer galaxy, and it was the single greatest wound the 4 hungers took in that entire age. They went into the warp itself, the 4 of them, together, walking through the door death could open into the god's own domain, the place no soul of this galaxy could go without being unmade or claimed. And in the warp, where the 4 hungers were near omnipotent, and reality was made of their appetite, the 4 riders did the one thing the gods had no defense against, because it was the one thing that had never once threatened them in all their existence. They refused to be food, in the one place where everything was food. They did not try to kill the gods. You cannot kill a god of the warp with a blade. The 4 riders were not fools, and Death had judged the altitude correctly from the first. What they did was worse, for a god. War planted himself at the heart of the warp, and became an anchor of pure unappetite, a point in the god's own domain that did not hunger, did not fear, did not despair, did not desire, a wound of nothing in a reality made of everything the gods fed on, and around that anchor, the warp's substance guttered and starved. Fury burned through the domains of desire and pride, and turned the 6th god's own perfect gardens to ash, that fed nothing. Strife walked the labyrinths of the 9th-fold schemer, and read every plan to its empty end, and spoke the emptiness aloud. And a scheme seen through is a scheme that feeds nothing. And the architect of fate felt its endless contingencies collapse into the one outcome it could not weave around, a mind that wanted nothing it could offer. And death. Death walked to the deepest place in the warp, the place where all four hungers touched, and did the thing only death could do. He did not reap a god. A god cannot be reaped. But he reaped the dead, the countless, numberless souls the four hungers held in their domains, the harvested and the corrupted and the imprisoned, the trillions the gods had fed upon across the age of the galaxy and never let go, the way Nurgle never let go of its garden. Death opened the door for all of them at once. Every soul the gods had eaten and kept, every scrap of harvest they held in reserve, every imprisoned dead thing that made the four hungers fat. Death reaped it, and sent it through the door, and did not let it back. In one stroke, in the gods' own domain, the reaper emptied the larder, not the gods themselves. Those endured, as they always would, but the vast held harvest that fed them, the reserve of stolen souls, the accumulated feast of an age, gone, sent through the door, denied. It was the greatest famine the four hungers had ever known, not a death blow. The gods were the setting ceiling, and they endured, and they would feed again, in time, as this galaxy went on making food of everything. But a wound, a true wound, the first in 10,000 years. Four souls from outside creation had walked into the gods' own domain, and emptied their larder and starved them, all four at once. And then, before the galaxy could build a single shrine to the deed, before one loyalist could utter one prayer to the four riders who wounded the gods, death opened the council's seam, and the four horsemen stepped back through it, out of the Warhammer galaxy and into the between place, leaving behind them no relic to worship, no cult to feed the warp, no new gods for the hungers to eat. They left only the wound and the fear, and a galaxy exactly as doomed as it had always been, but with gods, for the first time in 10,000 years, that had learned to be afraid of a door. The four riders stood again before the Charred Council in the Ember Lake, and the three great faces of fire looked upon them, and there was a silence. "You did not restore the balance," the first face said at last. "There was no balance to restore," Death answered. "You knew that when you threw us, a galaxy with no fulcrum, ruled by a corpse and besieged by gods, doing to itself what the Nephilim did to creation. There was nothing to balance. There was only a lesser horror, holding a greater horror at bay, and a war that had to run its course, and four gods that fed on all of it. The mask lifted toward the fire, so we did not restore the balance. We did the only true thing there was to do. We starved the things that had none. We wounded the gods, and we left before the wounding could make gods of us, and we gave that galaxy the one thing you actually sent us to give it." He was silent a moment, a verdict its gods could not swallow. The three faces of the Charred Council burned low, and considered the four riders who had gone into a galaxy where the council's writ did not run, and come back having judged it true. "The web is quieter," the third face admitted. "The strand that screamed, it screams less. You did not save them, but you frightened the things that were tearing them, and you did not become one of the things that tear. That is more than we hoped for, when we threw 4 coins into the furnace." "You threw us as bait," Strife said, and the old razor was back in the drawl, but there was no anger under it now, only the flat, clear sight of a thing that had seen the whole board. 4 souls too rich for the gods to resist, scattered into the middle of their feast, and you hoped we'd land as a verdict. Well, we did. He looked up at the fire that had made his sister a fratricide siblings, and himself a weapon, and all 4 of them the executioners of their own kind. "And here's what I learned in your furnace, Council, that I'll give you for free. That galaxy was doomed, is doomed. Nothing we did changed that, but it was full of souls that kept faith in a burning dark for a father who'd already lost, and gods that couldn't eat the ones who wouldn't kneel, and a dying old horror on a golden throne who agreed he deserved to fall and held the line anyway because the alternative was worse." The cynic's mouth quirked, without humor. "You want to call that a galaxy with no balance? Maybe, but I stood in it, and I'll tell you, the thing that held that galaxy up wasn't a scale. It was the handful of things in it that the gods couldn't eat. And there aren't many settings in all the numberless galaxies under your law that are darker than that one. or that have more of that particular kind of unkillable weight holding up the dark? The Charred Council did not answer that. Perhaps it had no answer. The three faces of fire only burned, and watched, and were, for the space of a breath, quiet. And the Four Horsemen stood together in the Ember Lake, War the anchor, Death the door, Fury the fire, Strife the eyes. Four souls of an ended world who had gone into the grimmest galaxy in all creation, and refused to be its food, and starved its gods, and come home without becoming the thing they judged. Somewhere across an unthinkable gulf, in a galaxy of 100,000 million stars, the war ground on toward its doomed and inevitable end. A father would break his son and be broken, an empire would survive and rot, and four gods, wounded and hungry and afraid, would feed again in time, but would never again reach for a soul without first making very sure it was one they could swallow. Because once, in the age of the heresy, four riders had walked into their larder and emptied it, and left nothing behind to worship, and gone home. And in the grim darkness of the far future, the gods remembered the door, and were afraid. The Charred Council had sent four riders to restore a balance in a galaxy that never had one, and four riders had come home having done something the Council never asked for and could not have named. They had gone into the darkest reach of all creation, a place ruled by a corpse, and besieged by gods, and dedicated wholly to fratricide, and they had refused, every one of them, to be made smaller by it. War would not kill without a verdict. Death would not reap what he had not judged. Fury would not be seduced by the pride she had already conquered. Strife would not be woven into a scheme he could see through. And none of the four, not the wrathful, not the pale, not the proud, not the cynical, would let a galaxy that made gods out of everything make gods out of them. They struck the one blow that could not feed the dark, and then they left before the striking could poison them. And that leaving was the wisest thing done in the whole long tragedy of that age. The galaxy remained doomed. The gods remained. But for 1 hour in the endless war, the hungers of the warp had met something they could not eat, and learned, at the emptying of their larder, what it means to be judged by a door that opens only outward. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But once, there was also a verdict, and the gods have not forgotten it.